Chapter 1. There was a little light in the darkness. On a starless and moonless night, there wasn't the slightest bit of light in the misty valley. Apart from the faintly discernible light in the center of the distant valley, most of the place was covered in boundless darkness. The night was somewhat cold, and the bleak sound of the wind was accompanied by a slight chill. When the wind blew through the valley, a strange dark color surged like a tide. It was a mist unique to this valley. The valley was very large. During the day, one could see the undulating mountains surrounding it, but during the night, one could only vaguely see the tall shadows, like a silent giant standing on this piece of land. The gap between two mountains on the northwest side of the valley was the only way in and out of the misty valley. Outside the valley, on the same rugged and dangerous mountain path, a figure was walking over. There was a sudden murderous intent in the darkness. Someone in front of the mountain path shouted a few words in a low voice. The figure that was walking over stopped for a moment. With the dim light in the night, one could see that the person was a young man dressed in black. The young man's expression was calm, as if he was not surprised by the sudden appearance of this obstruction. After listening to the whisper in the darkness, he also used a low voice to reply. One question and one answer, like a password, but also like a secret code. Soon after, the murderous intent hidden in the darkness slowly receded, and the black-clothed youth continued to walk forward. However, this part of the mountain path to the entrance of the misty valley seemed quiet and cold, but on this night, it seemed to be particularly strict. On the way, just the same kind of questioning had appeared 3 times. The black-clothed youth answered fluently, calmly passing each of the questioning. In the darkness of the night and the cold night wind, he gradually approached the entrance of the valley. At the side of the mountain path at the entrance, there was a raised hill. Several rocks of different sizes were scattered on the hill, and one could vaguely see a white figure standing at the top of the hill. The black-clothed youth's body paused for a moment. After standing in the same place for a moment, he turned around and walked up the hill. There was no path on the small hill. Weeds grew and swayed slightly in the night wind. When he was about to reach the top of the small hill, the black-robed young man saw a wooden sign stuck in the ground in front of him. From the bottom to the top, there was a strange pattern engraved on it. Above, there were gods flying in the sky, and below, there were ghosts howling. In the middle, there was an incomparably huge tree that stood between the sky and the earth, connecting gods and ghosts. It looked like a picture of a giant tree with gods and ghosts attached to the tree. The black-clothed young man glanced at the wooden sign. After pausing on the picture on it for a moment, he looked at the figure in white standing 10 feet behind the wooden sign. In such a dark night, a person dressed in white was naturally very conspicuous. At this time, as if hearing the footsteps, the person in white turned around and saw that it was an extremely handsome man. When he saw the man in black, the corners of his mouth curled into a smile. "You're here, He Lang." The black-clothed youth called He Lang nodded and walked over. At the same time, he said, "Yun Jian, if your father saw you dressed like this, I'm afraid he would scold you again." Yun Jian's expression was relaxed and calm. He smiled, "It's okay. Tonight's important matter is imminent. The old man has a lot of things to do in the desolate valley. Why would he care about me?" He Lang smiled and walked over to stand side by side with Yun Jian. Looking into the distance, he saw that in the night, other than the dense fog in the valley behind him, there were countless mountain ranges in the distance. Although it was impossible to see the true appearance of the mountains during the day, one could still imagine the majesty and grandeur of the mountains. Yun Jian suddenly let out a long breath and said, "He Lang, how long have you been in the divine sect?" 6 years. So long. Yun Jian's face showed a trace of emotion. He then smiled and said, "I still remember that when you first came, you were still a teenager, about the same age as Xiaoqing. Now, in the blink of an eye, you've both grown up." He Lang smiled and did not say anything. Yun Jian continued, "Oh right, Xiaoqing also came tonight. She might be here soon. Do you want to wait for her?" He Lang shook his head and said, "The elder ordered me to send the last blood soul crystal into the valley for the god-subduing incantation. I'm afraid that the divine incantation will be activated soon and I won't be able to come out. I'll see you later. Yun Jian raised his eyebrows and revealed a strange expression. He looked at Hei Lang and sighed after a moment. Only someone like you has the ability to obtain such a rare object like the blood soul crystal. No wonder my father has valued you so much all these years. He's even more intimate than me, his own son. Hei Lang raised his head to look at Yun Jian and frowned. He seemed to want to say something, but Yun Jian immediately laughed and said, all right, it's just a joke. What kind of relationship do we have? How can I doubt you? As he spoke, he seemed to have suddenly thought of something. A trace of ridicule appeared on his face as he said to Hei Lang, oh right, when the matter is over, quickly come back to me. Xiao Qing might have a secret to tell you. Hei Lang was startled and said, secret? What secret? Yun Jian smiled and said, if I say it, would it still be a secret? Just remember to come back and see me later. Hei Lang thought for a moment and nodded slightly, all right. As he spoke, he nodded to Yun Jian, turned around, and strode away. Not long after, he walked down the hill and into the valley, disappearing into the boundless darkness. After Hei Lang walked for about the time it took to brew a cup of tea, there was suddenly movement on the mountain path below. After a while, a light sound was heard and a light body flew up from below. She turned around in midair and landed beside Yun Jian. It was a beautiful woman that was as beautiful as a flower. When Yun Jian saw her, there was a trace of joy on his face. However, when he saw the woman beside him, he frowned and snorted, nonsense. Aren't you afraid of accidentally stumbling? It'll be too late to regret it then. The beautiful girl giggled and seemed to be very close to Yun Jian. She grabbed his arm and said with a smile, big brother, you're here. What's there to be afraid of? Yun Jian shook his head and smiled bitterly. How can I have such a heartless sister like you? Oh right, Hei Lang just left here and went into the valley. The sister he mentioned, who was also the beautiful woman named Yun Xiaoqing, let out an ah and looked towards the valley. She then complained to Yun Jian, really? Big brother, why didn't you stop him? You clearly know that I have something to say to him. Yun Jian shook his head and said, the important matter is more important. He has the blood soul crystal and needs to be sent into the Great Kala Array in the valley. When the God-subduing incantation is activated, he still needs to help father and the other elders. He really can't stay here for too long. Chapter 2. Yun Xiaoqing pursed her lips and suddenly looked perturbed. She sighed softly and muttered, if he knew about this, what would he think? Would he not like it? As she spoke, she bit her lips lightly and unconsciously placed one hand on her lower abdomen. Yun Jian smiled and said, silly girl, don't worry. Black Wolf will definitely be very happy. Yun Xiaoqing looked a little worried. She looked at Yun Jian and said, big brother, how did you know? Yun Jian laughed and shook his head to comfort her. You are childhood sweethearts and grew up together. Others may not understand this relationship, but do you not believe him? Moreover, we cultivators steal the creation of heaven and earth to obtain supreme power. The price is that it is difficult to have children. The higher the cultivation realm, the more it is so. Now that you are pregnant with his child, this is a joyous occasion. Would Black Wolf be angry? Yun Xiaoqing's eyes flickered. There seemed to be a layer of ripples in her crystal-clear eyes. They were bright and had a hint of depth. After a while, she finally nodded heavily. A smile appeared on her face again. She nodded and said, big brother, you are right. Yun Jian smiled and touched Yun Xiaoqing's head dotingly. He said, anyway, I am waiting for my nephew to be born. Oh yes, I forgot to tell you. Father also knows about this. Ah. Yun Xiaoqing was shocked. Her face turned red and she was embarrassed and annoyed. She said angrily, big brother, why did you say such things? Father is going to scold me to death. Yun Jian sneered and said, why would father scold you? Let me tell you frankly. Father is very happy about this. Yin Xiaoqing's eyes widened and she said in disbelief, "Really?" Yin Jian said, "Of course. Otherwise, why do you think Black Wolf could enter the forbidden land of the Desolate Valley and even participate in the God-subduing mantra? Even if he has the secret technique to condense the blood-soul crystal, it is still possible to not let him participate at the most crucial moment." Yin Xiaoqing said softly, "You mean, father wants to?" Yun Jian continued with a smile. "Naturally, after knowing that he's about to have a grandson, he finally sees He Lang as a family. The Tao techniques that the two of us cultivate are in conflict with the God-subduing mantra, so we can't get close to the valley. But He Lang has the bloodline of the burning blood crystal, so he's close to the God-subduing mantra. If we don't vigorously support our future son-in-law, who else can we support?" Yin Xiaoqing's face revealed a look of relief and joy. She nodded repeatedly and looked at the dark valley. She put her hands together in front of her chest and prayed softly, "May everything go smoothly and everyone return safely." After saying that, she glanced around from the corner of her eyes. Suddenly, she saw something and let out an "ah," as if she was pleasantly surprised. Yin Jian looked from the side and saw Yun Xiaoqing walk to the side and pluck something from the wild grass on the ground. Yin Jian took a closer look and saw that it was a red flower. Yun Xiaoqing beamed and said to Yun Jian, "Big brother, look, the acacia flower has bloomed." Yun Jian shrugged his shoulders. The acacia flower was just a common wildflower that could be found everywhere in the mountains. It had no spiritual tattoos, nor was it a spiritual material or a medicinal herb. It was useless to cultivators, so he said grumpily, "It's just a wildflower. Why are you making such a fuss?" Yin Xiaoqing didn't care about him and only smiled as she held the red acacia flower in her palm and looked at it. Then, she said with a smile, "This flower has bloomed so beautifully, it must be a good omen." The night wind blew, and the bright red petals of the acacia flower trembled slightly in her snow-white palm, as if they were whispering softly. He Lang walked into the misty valley. At first, the path was a rugged path between two towering peaks, but as he went deeper, the path gradually widened. What was strange was that he didn't light any lamps along the way, and his surroundings were dark, but he didn't make any mistakes, as if he was already very familiar with the terrain here. After walking through the small path into the valley, although it was still dark ahead, He Lang seemed to have adapted to the darkness, and the ground beneath his feet seemed to have become even more flat. This was the middle of the valley. Because of a strange reason, this valley looked ordinary, but in reality, there were no spiritual herbs that could grow in this valley. There were mostly ordinary weeds and trees, as well as common wildflowers like the acacia flower. Because of this, to the cultivators in the world, this valley was desolate, and this was where the name, Desolate Valley, came from. He Lang looked forward and saw that in the center of the valley in front of him, there was a ball of fire burning. This scene reflected in this valley that was completely shrouded in darkness, and the dot of fire was especially conspicuous. He took a deep breath. At this moment, when there was no one around, he looked a little nervous, and kept staring at that spot. After a while, he gently spat out a turbid breath, and his face quickly returned to calmness. Then he strode towards the light of the fire. Under the night sky, the depths of the valley seemed to be filled with a strange aura. It was invisible and colorless, but it seemed to be everywhere, which made people's heart beat faster. It seemed to be an emotion of admiration and fear for the unknown and terrible power. The flames came from a bonfire burning in the valley. What was lit was not firewood, but some strange things. Bones, furs, stones, oddly shaped medicinal herbs, and the strangest thing was large chunks of flesh and blood. They burned silently just like that. If one walked closer, he would find that the strange fuel would flash with strange spirit patterns from time to time, flashing and emitting invisible but strong waves. A large wooden sign about 10 meters high was inserted outside the bonfire. As He Lang had seen before, it was painted with a giant tree pattern of immortals and ghosts. Next to the bonfire sat 3 old men. One of them had a plain face that looked like an immortal, and the outline of his face was vaguely similar to Yun Jian. He was sitting on the main seat of honor. The old man on his left was bald and fat, but he had a pair of white eyebrows that hung down his cheeks. The old man on his right was thin, dark, and haggard, with only skin left on his face. He looked somewhat terrifying. He Lang walked to the bonfire and bowed to the three old men, saying, "Greetings, elders." The three people turned to look at him at the same time. The dignified elder and the fat elder both nodded, but the skinny and haggard elder's face darkened. He suddenly sneered and said, "Yun Shouyang, what right does your subordinate have to be in the divine formation?" Chapter 3. The old man in the middle frowned and revealed a trace of displeasure on his face. He said indifferently, "Just based on the 3 blood soul crystals he obtained, is that enough?" The skinny elder's expression was cold, and he did not seem to fear Elder Yun Shouyang at all. He was about to speak when he heard the fat elder next to him try to smooth things over. All right. This little guy can obtain blood soul crystals. Not only is it beneficial for casting the incantation, but his cultivation method must also be compatible with the god-subduing incantation. Everyone is free to do whatever they want, and it's not like we're taking anything from you. Skinny guy, don't talk so much. The skinny elder snorted coldly and closed his eyes. Yun Shouyang smiled at the fat elder, and the fat elder nodded in response. Yun Shouyang then waved at He Lang. He Lang walked over and knelt down a little behind Yun Shouyang. He then took out a completely black dagger and placed it on the ground. 3 inches in front of the dagger's blade, there was a small crystal that was bright red and had the texture of an amber agate. It was attached to the dagger. Yun Shouyang's gaze swept over the small red crystal, and then he looked at He Lang. His eyes were gentle as he nodded at him. He Lang lowered his head and did not speak. He quietly knelt behind him and waited. However, when his gaze swept over the ground in front of him, he suddenly noticed that in a small patch of wild grass not far away, a small red flower was blooming beautifully. He glanced at the flower and then looked away. This dark night seemed to be exceptionally long. Even time seemed to slow down at this moment. Endless darkness clustered around this valley. After an unknown amount of time, the 4 people by the bonfire suddenly raised their heads at the same time. In the deep darkness in the distance, from an unknown place, a heart-palpitating drumbeat suddenly sounded. The bonfire in front of them, which was still burning, suddenly trembled violently. It became chaotic, and countless sparks flew. If flames had a life of their own, then at this moment, this ball of fire seemed to be roaring angrily, but also seemed to be afraid and panicking, constantly trembling and swaying there. The sound of heavy footsteps suddenly came from the valley. The next sound came from an extremely far distance. In just a few steps, he had already crossed a long distance and arrived near the flame. The faint drumming never disappeared, and it seemed to be getting more and more urgent, making one's heart beat faster uncontrollably. A moment later, a tall figure slowly walked out from the darkness. The flames suddenly dimmed for a moment. It was because all the flames had suddenly lowered their heads, as if they were expressing their respect to this person. Then, the figure casually waved his hand. Suddenly, the flames grew brighter and soared into the sky. In an instant, they grew several times stronger and illuminated the surrounding area of more than 10 zhang. He Lang raised his head and his gaze landed on the figure that was slowly approaching. The person who had come was a very old man, but he was not a human cultivator that was commonly seen in the divine central plains. He looked to be at least half the height of an ordinary person. Moreover, he seemed to be hunched over and looked somewhat tired. The old man held a thick wooden staff in his hand. It was incomparably heavy, and its surface was carved with bright red flame patterns. 2 sharp fangs protruded from his mouth. Perhaps because he had lived through so many years, the fangs had turned from snow-white to a dull gray. And this person's face was tattooed with countless dark blue totem patterns, most of which were related to fire. He looked especially terrifying. He Lang's pupils contracted slightly, and a word suddenly flashed through his mind: barbarian. The barbarians were a strange race that lived in the southern border continent of the divine central plains. They were separated from the human race by the incomparably huge land of chaos. In the past, although the human cultivators did not have a blood feud with the barbarians, they had never lived in harmony with each other. Just like this barbarian who looked very old at this moment, when he walked past the wooden sign, his eyes swept over the huge tree pattern on the wooden sign, and a trace of obvious contempt suddenly flashed across his eyes. At the same time, 7 unusually tall and majestic figures appeared behind the old barbarian. Without exception, they were all muscular barbarian warriors. Each of them was like a small mountain, and their bulging muscles seemed to contain endless power. Even if it was just a hand-to-hand fight, ordinary demonic beasts would probably not be a match for them. However, these 7 incredibly powerful barbarian warriors seemed to be unusually respectful towards the old barbarian in front of them. When they saw the old man wave his hand casually, they stopped in the darkness and did not come any closer. He Lang's gaze fell on the old barbarian again. He thought to himself, legend has it that the barbarian tribes have always had a position of shaman, a supreme leader. Perhaps this old man in front of me is one. At this moment, the gazes of the 3 elders also fell on the old barbarian's face. After a while, Yun Shouyang nodded at him and said, I've long heard of the great name of the fire shaman. Now that I've seen it for myself, the Venerable One indeed has supreme power, and is especially sensitive to fire spiritual energy. I admire you, I admire you. The barbarian old man let out a low laugh. His voice was abnormally deep and hoarse, like the sound of a broken bellow, and it made one's hair stand on end. He said, in the eyes of you human cultivators, we are all uncivilized barbarians. What's there to admire? Yun Shouyang smiled faintly and said, since we've entered the 3 realms divine sect, we've always seen all living beings in the 3 realms as equals. We don't have the leisure to differentiate between these meaningless things. The old barbarian laughed softly and did not say anything. Yun Shouyang asked again, have you brought the thing? The old barbarian put his hand into his bosom, and after searching for a while, he took out a necklace. There were many white bone ornaments hanging on the necklace, and in the middle of the largest bone, there was a small hole dug out. Inside the hole was a small object that was shining with a strange luster. The 2 ends of the object were pointed, and the middle was bulging. It looked like the grain of wood, and it was dark green in color. It looked like the seed of some unknown tree. Looking at it from afar, it did not seem to be anything special, but it made people feel that this seed was full of vitality. As soon as this item appeared, the 3 elders of the 3 realms divine sect were shocked. They stood up together and stared at the white bone, especially at the seed, not letting go. After a while, the 3 of them looked at each other and nodded slightly. It seemed that they had confirmed it. The rotund elder seemed to be the most excited. He clenched his fists and said with an eager and excited expression, since everything is ready, let's begin. Chapter 4. With that said, the fat elder was the first to impatiently return to his original seat. Yun Shouyang and the skinny elder looked at each other and sat down as well. The bonfire burned brightly, illuminating the surroundings and revealing the deep wrinkles, scars, and strange totems and tattoos on the old barbarian's face. He looked like an old beast, and there seemed to be a trace of vigilance hidden in the depths of his eyes. His gaze swept over the 3 elders, and then he slowly walked to the fire and sat down on the last seat. In between, he even panted a few times. His heavy breathing sounded like the whine of some kind of wild beast, as if his old body was already somewhat unable to bear the burden. Yun Shouyang patiently waited for the fire shaman to sit down, then said in a low voice, let's begin, wait. Suddenly, a deep and coarse voice interrupted Yun Shouyang's words. The 3 elders of the divine sect of the 3 realms looked at the fire shaman at the same time, only to see the old barbarian slowly raise a finger and point to Yun Shouyang's side. This person, let him go. The fat and skinny elders frowned at the same time. Yun Shouyang snorted and said, He Lang is my confidant, and he has cultivated a secret technique that can condense blood soul crystals. Venerable One, you should know what that thing is for the god subjugation mantra, right? The fire in front of him was reflected in the old eyes of the fire shaman, but they seemed unusually bright in the vicissitudes of life, as if 2 balls of fire were burning from within his body. He said slowly, I don't trust him. Yun Shouyang raised his eyebrows, and a trace of anger flashed across his eyes. He then said coldly, according to the ancient records of the divine sect, when casting the god's subjugation mantra, if you have the help of the blood soul crystal secret technique, the chances of success will increase by at least 10%. I wonder if the Venerable One has any objections to this? 10%. The fat and skinny elder's expressions changed at the same time. It was clear that this seemingly insignificant 10% was extremely significant to them. However, they didn't know what this god-vanquishing curse was. It was so difficult for people of their statuses. After hearing Yun Shouyang's explanation, both of their faces lit up with joy. The rotund elder could not help but grumble to Yun Shouyang in a low voice, "Why didn't you tell me and the skinny one about such benefits?" Yun Shouyang nodded slightly at him, then looked at the fire shaman sitting on the other side of the fire. His eyes were bright, and just as he was about to say something, he suddenly heard the old barbarian's hoarse and low voice ring out again. This time, he repeated, "I don't believe him." Even the fat and thin elders couldn't bear to watch any longer. They were figures of extremely high status in the central divine prefecture, and their eyes grew cold. Yun Shouyang frowned. "Then what do you want?" "Let him go." The fire shaman's hoarse voice reverberated in the empty valley like a dying beast king. He was old, but still had the majesty of old. "If you insist on keeping him here, you must plant a black flame curse on him. He must swear that he will not harm the god-vanquishing curse, or else he will be devoured by the black flames. His flesh and blood will be burned dry, and his soul will be destroyed. He will never be able to enter the cycle of reincarnation, and will suffer the pain of being burned by the flames forever. Only then can I be at ease." Yun Shouyang flew into a rage. He suddenly stood up and glared at the fire shaman. "How dare you plant such a demonic technique on my disciple?" The fire shaman sneered, the corners of his eyes drooping slightly. He did not seem to care about Yun Shouyang's anger at all. His old eyes seemed to have seen too many vicissitudes in this world, and now, only the raging flames were left. However, at this moment, another voice suddenly came from Yun Shouyang's side. It was the skinny elder. He said calmly, "The Venerable One's words do not seem to be wrong." Yun Shouyang turned his head abruptly and stared at the skinny elder with a hint of surprise and anger. However, the skinny elder did not show any fear, and only looked at him calmly. On the other side, the fire shaman let out a strange, hoarse laugh. It was as piercing as a ghost's as he looked over. Yun Shouyang took a deep breath and turned to look at the fat elder. Just as he was about to speak, the fat elder coughed lightly and looked at him. "Brother Yun, I also think that the Venerable One's words are not without reason, just in case." Perhaps because he had a good relationship with Yun Shouyang, he pondered for a moment and said a few more words to smooth things over. "Moreover, we all know that although the black flame curse is sinister and vicious, it is still a kind of curse. As long as the little fellow does not violate the oath, the curse will not be triggered, and there will be no problem." Yun Shouyang clearly did not expect the fat elder to say such a thing, and his expression changed for a moment. With his status and experience, he naturally knew a thing or two about the black flame curse. Although the fat elder's words were generally correct, this kind of mysterious curse that originated from the barbarian tribes deep in the southern border continent was not that simple. Just as he was thinking about letting He Lang leave this place, he suddenly heard He Lang's voice from behind, "Master, disciple is willing." As soon as he said this, there was a moment of silence around the fire. Everyone looked at the black-robed young man, including the fire shaman. The fire shaman's wise and experienced gaze also fell on Black Wolf's face. Yun Shouyang frowned and said, "The risks involved." Black Wolf knelt on the ground, his body as straight as a javelin, and said expressionlessly, "Everything is for Master's sake. This disciple will face some risks, but they are not worth mentioning." Yun Shouyang stared deeply at his young face. After a moment of silence, he suddenly took a deep breath and said, "Good. You are indeed my good disciple, I did not misjudge you." Black Wolf lowered his head and did not speak. Yun Shouyang returned to his seat and said in a low voice, "You may go." He Lang agreed and walked around the bonfire to the front of the fire shaman. Then, just like before, he quietly knelt beside the old barbarian. The fire shaman's aged gaze swept across the young man. Even though he was an old man of his age and status, he couldn't help but reveal a tinge of admiration in his eyes. But it was clear that this bit of admiration wouldn't affect his will and decision in the slightest. Under the watchful eyes of the other 3 elders of the divine sect of the 3 realms, a short but strange ceremony quickly unfolded. The fire shaman first put his hand directly into the burning bonfire, paused for a moment, and when he retracted it, there was a burning flame in the middle of his palm. His flesh did not seem to have any reaction under the burning flame. Then, everyone heard him recite an ancient and mysterious incantation in a low voice. Chapter 5. The voice seemed to have come from the ancient times. It echoed in the distant past, passing through time and returning to this world. It brought with it a strange and mysterious power. After a while, blood flowed out of the old barbarian's eyes. Black blood. He used his hand to bring the ball of flame closer to his face. That strange face looked like a demon or a ghost, incomparably ferocious and terrifying. The ball of flame then began to twist wildly, as if it had obtained some kind of power. The 2 streaks of black blood quickly dried up, and the black blood floated up and merged with the ball of flame. The ball of flame turned black. It was a ball of black flame. Everything quietened down. The fire shaman chanted an ancient incantation, and under his guidance, He Lang faced the ball of black flame and swore an oath. He swore that he would not harm the god-vanquishing incantation tonight, and swore that he would do his best for it. If he broke this promise, he would suffer the pain of the black flame's backlash. As He Lang spoke, the ball of black flame swayed and slowly approached his face. Finally, from the center of his forehead, it silently and strangely merged with his flesh and blood, disappearing without a trace. When everything was over, the fire shaman waved his hand. He Lang stood up silently and walked back to the other side of the fire. Yun Shouyang nodded at his disciple and patted him on the shoulder. When he placed his hand on He Lang's shoulder, He Lang could feel that this powerful old man's demeanor was different from usual, as well as the slight strength he used. He raised his head to look at Yun Shouyang and nodded slightly. Then, he returned to his usual silence. At that moment, Yun Shouyang's eyes were filled with love. He thought to himself that he had not misjudged He Lang. After handing little Qing over to him in the future, he would have nothing to worry about. The cold atmosphere seemed to suddenly ease up after the strange incantation. Even the fire shaman, who had always been cold, seemed to have a hint of a smile on his face. Soon, the few of them began their final negotiations. The crucial god-subduing incantation was about to begin. He Lang quietly knelt on the ground, the words of those people who finally felt at ease reverberated in his ears. His eyes suddenly looked at the acacia flower, and then, in more places on the ground further away, in this valley, among the weeds that could be seen everywhere, there were already bright red flowers blooming everywhere. Facing the night wind, the red acacia flower slightly trembled, like a beautiful and enchanting woman singing in the dark night. The night was still deep and silent. This long night seemed to continue endlessly in the darkness, until that speck of light suddenly burst out from the deepest part of the darkness. The dazzling radiance was like the sun that suddenly rose in the night sky. It shone brightly and turned into a huge fireball that burned fiercely. Immediately after, all the flames condensed into an incomparably majestic pillar of fire that soared into the sky, shooting into the incomparably thick dark clouds. Suddenly, the wind blew fiercely, the dark clouds rolled, the heaven and earth trembled, and a terrifying aura slowly spread from the horizon. In the desolate valley, was the source of the huge fireball. At the moment, beside the original bonfire, the 3 elders of the 3 realms divine sect and the fire shaman were in 4 different directions, their hands reaching into the burning flame in the middle. At this moment, below them and the surrounding ground of more than 100 feet, there were suddenly countless strange patterned flames, forming a huge and mysterious formation. All the living creatures were forced to retreat out of this powerful formation by an invisible force, including the 7 powerful barbarian guards brought by the fire shaman. The only one left in the center of this formation, besides the 4 powerful figures, was He Lang. At this moment, the flame had completely turned pure white. One could imagine how high the temperature had reached. And in the deepest part of the flame, there was a white bone necklace floating. Under the burning of the incomparably powerful flames, the necklace cracked inch by inch. All of the bones were burned to ashes. Only the largest piece of bone belonged to an unknown exotic beast, and it was still able to hold on. However, cracks could still be seen on it, and it seemed like it wouldn't be able to hold on much longer. And in the center of the white bone, the strange seed seemed to not be affected by the flame at all. It still emitted a vigorous vitality in the dark green luster, and seemed to be more vigorous than before. It seemed to be slowly absorbing the power of this flame. At the same time, when a large amount of flame passed through the seed and shot into the night sky, it seemed to be contaminated with that unique aura, faintly summoning something to the endless sky. An ancient incantation suddenly sounded, and the four extremely powerful people looked up at the sky. Almost at the same time, a terrifying aura from the sky descended upon this valley. He Lang sensed something and looked up. He was shocked to see that in the dark clouds in the sky, a huge dark crack had slowly opened up. Then, from that incomparably deep, bottomless abyss of darkness, there seemed to be a strange gaze looking over. That crack slowly closed. The ground of the entire deserted valley suddenly began to tremble, and a rumbling sound came from the depths of the ground. At the same time, the surrounding formations on the ground all shone brightly at the same time, flashing with all their might, emitting a powerful force to suppress this piece of land. But under the pressure of the power in the sky, this large formation seemed to be quickly reaching its limit. Suddenly, in the dazzling light all around, Yun Shouyang shouted, "Release!" Without hesitation, He Lang immediately reached out and picked up the black dagger in front of him. With a shake of his arm, a strange blood-red light flashed across his body, and the small blood-like object flew out of the dagger and directly into the flames, landing precisely on the green seed. Boom! With a loud bang, the blood soul crystal instantly turned into nothingness, and the flames suddenly became 30% brighter. The surrounding temperature suddenly rose violently, and even the ground began to crack. But perhaps because of this powerful attraction, the dark crack in the sky also rapidly closed, and the door of darkness became bigger and bigger, and was about to completely open. An ancient aura spread out from this door of darkness, and an incomparably tall figure that seemed to dominate everything began to faintly appear from behind the door of darkness, and approached this world. And at this moment, the indistinct gaze was focused on that strange seed, as if only that seed, full of vitality, was the most attractive thing in this world. Chapter 6. Wu. It was a strange sound, like an ancient call. It was as if an ancient song from ancient times was echoing in the dark. A beam of light that did not seem to exist in this world shot out from the door of darkness like a sharp sword. It flowed down the pillar of fire on the ground, then split into four and landed directly on the heads of the four people who were casting the spell. An indescribably powerful force came crashing down from the sky and poured into the bodies of the four people. Their bodies began to change rapidly, and their clothes began to tear, as if they could not withstand the incomparably powerful spiritual power. But the faces of the four people were filled with ecstasy. They gritted their teeth and endured the pain, but at the same time, they could feel the wild spiritual power in their bodies surging towards a power that was unimaginable in the past. It felt as if they had reached the heavens in a single step, or as if they were between God and man. In the next moment, they might become God. In the firelight, the door of darkness in the sky was about to descend, and the ancient figure was about to appear like a god. Everything had reached the final juncture, but it seemed that there was only one last step, that one last distance, but the door still did not open. It was as if there was only that last bit of power left. Yin Shouyang roared, "Black Wolf!" But the corner of his eyes suddenly froze. In that split second, he suddenly saw that there was no one beside him. The man in black who had been guarding him silently and determinedly had suddenly disappeared. Yin Shouyang was shocked, but before he could react, he suddenly felt a chill in his heart. A black sword had pierced through his heart and came out from his chest. A pale hand grabbed Yin Shouyang's shoulder from behind. The black-robed young man stuck close to him, his face expressionless. Then, his other hand gripped the incomparably sharp black sword, and he suddenly pulled it out from Yun Shouyang's back. Yun Shouyang shouted. His body was about to react, but he was shocked to find that he could not move at all. The powerful force that descended from the sky was pouring into his spirit meridian and qi si, giving him supreme spiritual power. But at the same time, it also caused all the meridians in his body to expand, and he temporarily lost control of his body. Other than Yun Shouyang, the other three were in the same situation. At this moment, the three of them were looking at He Lang, who had suddenly turned violent and started killing people. However, none of them could react at this moment. At the very center of this shocking formation that was filled with unparalleled power, the weakest black-robed young man was impressively controlling everything at this moment. He Lang gripped the hilt of his sword tightly and pulled it out of Yun Shouyang's chest. Along with it, an unimaginable amount of blood spurted out like a rapid stream, instantly covering half of his body. It was the blood that was forced out by the power of the gods that fell from the sky and poured into his body. Once there was an outlet, it seemed to be about to be released under the great pressure. He Lang's face was also splattered with beads of blood, but he did not move at all. He looked at everything in front of him coldly, then without a word, he stabbed the black sword in his hand into the flesh on Yun Shouyang's back. One stab, another stab, and another stab. He ruthlessly and resolutely stabbed Yun Shouyang's chest into a bloody hole. After the 13th stab, the once invincible Yun Shouyang finally lost his last chance of survival in despair. He died with his head hanging down with his eyes wide open. Then, as if sensing something, He Lang raised his head to look at the door of darkness that had begun to tremble in the sky and let out a deafening roar. He casually threw away Yun Shouyang's lifeless body. The divine light beam that had been pouring into Yun Shouyang's body suddenly exploded, turning into countless beautiful fragments that fell into the darkness of the night. The originally stable and balanced pillars of fire and the door of darkness all trembled and shook violently. More and more pillars of light lost their light, while the divine light beams that had poured into the bodies of the other three people became brighter and their auras stronger. Crazy roars came from the door of darkness, and below, everything seemed to be getting crazier and crazier. Under the despairing gazes of the three people, the unbalanced formation collapsed piece by piece. More and more divine power flowed down like an uncontrollable torrent. In the strong wind, their bodies slowly expanded like inflated balloons. Then, tongues of fire swept up and burned every corner of their bodies. Finally, there were suddenly 3 deafening explosions. Boom! 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 The 3 bodies suddenly exploded, turning into a rain of blood and shattered bones. They were engulfed by the darkness of the night and the crazy flames. Almost at the same time that the fire shaman's body exploded, as if triggered by an invisible force, the 7 powerful barbarian warriors that he had brought with him suddenly collapsed at the same time. They fell heavily onto the burning ground, as if the thread of life that had been entrusted to them had suddenly snapped, taking away their lives. The door of darkness in the sky also suddenly closed after a final roar and a deafening roar. Then, it disappeared into the darkness of the sky. On the ground, the flames spread in all directions, illuminating the entire barren valley within a radius of 1,000 feet. In the depths of the flames, He Lang rushed into the depths of the flames and grabbed the white bone with the strange seed embedded in it. Where the tentacles touched, the piece of white bone instantly shattered and turned into dust. Only the dark green seed remained. Unexpectedly, it was not damaged in the slightest and fell into Black Wolf's hand. But at this moment, He Lang's body suddenly trembled and he let out an incomparably miserable howl. Ah! The mournful howl spread far away, like the desperate howl of a wild beast. Black flames suddenly rose from his body and began to burn crazily. Strangely, this black flame incessantly burned his flesh, but it didn't damage He Lang's clothes in the slightest. He Lang felt like he was in purgatory. He kept howling at the sky. His flesh and blood were burning in the black flames. His skin was torn and his flesh was lacerated. Blood flowed out and quickly dried up. Indistinctly, a dazzling shadow appeared in the sea of qi on his abdomen. However, the terrifying black flames even burned this shadow. It broke into pieces and quickly disappeared into the shadows. Everything about He Lang, even his soul, seemed to be boiling, cracking, and shattering in the black flames. Chapter 7. For some unknown reason, Black Wolf did not collapse amidst the terrifying and cruel black flames. He roared and howled, but he still stood upright. Then, he walked out of the valley step by step. His flesh and blood looked like they were burning and melting. The black flames burned into his soul, causing his mind to turn blank and confused. However, this man who was trapped in hell still walked out step by step. Outside the valley, there were already sounds of fighting and shouting. It seemed like an intense battle was happening. Not long after, just as he was about to reach the entrance of the valley, a figure suddenly flashed across the mountain path in front of him. It was a beautiful woman. It was Yun Xiaoqing. She saw Black Wolf at a glance and instantly turned pale with fright. She pounced over and cried out in horror, Black Wolf, you, what happened to you?" Black Wolf's eyes had almost completely lost their luster. It was as if he had been completely burned by the terrifying pain. Perhaps he was just numb, or perhaps he had long developed an instinct. He leaned towards Yun Xiaoqing. Yun Xiaoqing shouted in panic. She opened her arms and wanted to hug him, but suddenly, Black Wolf raised his right hand. The black sword that was still in his hand stabbed into her chest. Yun Xiaoqing's voice came to an abrupt halt. Her beautiful face revealed a look of disbelief. She looked in horror at the man who was being burned by the black flames. Her mouth opened twice, but no sound came out. Then, she collapsed on her back. Her beautiful eyes widened, as if she could not believe what she saw. Blood splattered from her chest, staining a red acacia flower on the ground beside her. In just a short while, a white shadow appeared. It was Yun Jian who rushed in from outside the valley. He shouted loudly, "There are strong enemies attacking. There are many of them and they are very strong. Father." "Ah. What happened?" "Black Wolf, what happened to you?" Black Wolf leaned over. At this moment, Yun Jian had already clearly seen the terrifying scene of him being burned by the black flames. He could not believe his eyes for a moment and was dumbfounded. Suddenly, he also saw a black sword appear in front of him. In the terrifying flames, the sword stabbed into his chest. The two of them hugged each other tightly and stuck to each other. Blood spurted out and Yun Jian's body stiffened. There was still an expression of disbelief on his face. Although the terrifying black flame was still burning, it did not burn Yun Jian's body at all. It seemed to only burn on Black Wolf's flesh forever. Hot blood once again dyed Black Wolf's body red, causing him to become completely covered in blood. Coupled with the terrifying black flames, at this moment, Black Wolf was like an evil spirit that had walked out from hell. Yun Jian clutched his chest and collapsed weakly. Before he died, he suddenly saw Yun Xiaoqing lying on the ground not far away. At that moment, he seemed to have been provoked by something. He looked at He Lang in disbelief and roared, You actually killed her." Before he finished speaking, the black sword suddenly flew over from the darkness. With a swoosh, it cruelly and mercilessly pierced through his throat, suppressing the rest of Yun Jian's words. Yun Jian slowly lowered his head and seemed to shake his head with some difficulty. Then, he died. The black sword flew back, carrying a mournful blood color. He Lang faced the dark sky and once again let out a mournful and tragic howl. That pain seemed to have burned all of his consciousness. But for some reason, he still did not stop. Just like that, he turned into the figure of an evil spirit and staggered in this dark valley. Gradually, he disappeared into the darkness. In the remaining footprints, each step was stained with blood. Each step was bright red. In this dark night, under the wild flames, in the end, only the dark red acacia flowers were left, like blood, trembling in the wind. The black flames burned crazily, burning everything. The entire world was in darkness. There seemed to be only crazy howls and the tragic sight of flesh and blood being burned dry. Ah! With a low roar, Lu Chen suddenly woke up from his sleep. He suddenly sat up and gasped for breath. Sweat seeped out of his forehead. The thin quilt covering his body slipped down, revealing his strong upper body that was not covered at all. He did not care and only breathed heavily. He stared blankly at the strange bed in front of him. There was a glimmer of light outside the window. It was already early in the morning. At this time, beside him, a white and plump arm stretched out from the side and gently wiped the sweat off his forehead. Then, a soft voice said, "What's wrong? Did you have a nightmare again?" Lu Chen turned his head and saw that under the same thin quilt, there was a beautiful woman lying next to him. At this moment, after a night of sleep, she seemed to be a little tired, with a trace of laziness. Her beautiful hair was like clouds, draping over her white and smooth shoulders. The thin quilt was across her chest, revealing an alluring and plump skin. Lu Chen shook his head and said, "It's nothing." The woman's jade-like fingers lightly touched Lu Chen's face, caressing the side of his temples and the skin under his chin before finally resting on his shoulder. The strong and bulging muscles and her delicate fingers seemed to form a sharp contrast. Her voice at this moment, in this early morning, was like a lost dream that had not yet woken up. It carried a bit of fleeting and unusual gentleness as she said, "You just love to show off. It's still early, why don't you?" Lu Chen suddenly turned his head and smiled at her. "Ding dang, I only have one spirit stone left on me today." The woman's fingers suddenly stopped, and then she raised her eyes to look at Lu Chen. Lu Chen was still laughing, his smile was warm and sincere. Suddenly, the thin quilt on Ding Dong's body moved, and under the quilt, she heavily kicked Lu Chen, revealing a bit of snow-white skin. Her eyebrows wrinkled, and she hatefully said, "Smelly man, you talk so much nonsense, why aren't you scramming?" Lu Chen laughed out loud, and jumped off the bed. He then found his clothes from the messy clothes on the ground, and quickly put them on. He then casually threw a pile of undergarments and skirts to Ding Dang, who was still lazing on the bed, and said with a smile, "Wake up, wake up. I say, don't be so lazy, I see that today's weather is not bad, with such a good morning light, why not go out for a walk?" Pay. Early in the morning, this lady had nothing better to do, so I went out for a stroll. At this time, the people outside are probably those idiots who work hard for a month, and can't even get a few spirit stones. Ding Dang pulled over the thin quilt and covered herself tightly, only revealing a pretty face, and then spat unhappily. Chapter 8. Hearing Ding Dong's complaint, Lu Chen did not get angry but instead smiled and said, "Hey, I'm about to go out, how can I leave now that you've said that?" He paused for a moment, then walked to the side of the bed and sat down. Out of nowhere, he took out a shiny spirit stone and threw it beside Ding Dong's pillow. Ding Dong's eyes immediately lit up, and with a cheer, she reached out to grab it, revealing a white jade arm. Lu Chen laughed, and took the opportunity to stretch his hand under the blanket to grab it. Ding Dang cried out in alarm, one hand holding the spirit stone into a fist and punched towards Lu Chen, the other hand pulling the blanket tightly to block that vulgar hand. Just that her hands and feet were in a mess, and her warm and soft body was still taken advantage of by him, forcefully touching it a few times. Lu Chen immediately jumped away, leaving the warm bed, and walked with large strides to the door, opening it and walking out. The woman's coquettish scolding came from the room behind him. "Damn, stinky men really are not good people, you better remember this." The fresh morning breeze blew down from the tea mountain in the distance. It swept over the clear, gurgling water of the clear stream, causing waves of ripples. It then brushed past the verdant bamboos and beautiful peach blossoms on both sides of the river. Thus, there was a hint of fragrance. It blew over the moss-covered wind and rain bridge, over the pond dam on the stream, over the bluestone road along the river, and finally, over the people walking in the morning light. Lu Chen stretched his waist, opening his mouth to let out a yawn, his face revealing a satisfied smile. His gaze looked around. This quiet village in the morning was the place he was currently living. This place was called Qingshitang Village, named after the clear brook that snaked through the middle of the village. Qingshatang Brook. The water was extremely clear, and the flow was gentle. Other than the deep pond at the bottom of the tea mountain, the deepest part of the brook was no more than a knee deep. Usually, many children in the village would play in the water. There were many pebbles in the brook, big and small, of all shapes and sizes, and there were often some nameless gray little fish swimming in the cracks, leisurely playing. There were many green bamboo and peach trees on both sides of the stream. In this bright and beautiful season of spring, it was the time of the year when the scenery was the best. The green bamboo leaves and the pink peach blossoms complemented each other and were reflected in the clear water. It was like a beautiful painting of a mountain village, too beautiful to behold. Lu Chen strolled along, listening to the crisp chirps of birds and the crowing of roosters in the distance. Numerous farmhouses appeared on both sides of the stream. It was a little messy, without any order, but it still had a bit of the leisurely atmosphere of the countryside. At this time, there were already people walking around Qingshatang village. Lu Chen bumped into quite a few people on the road by Qingshatang Creek. They greeted him with a smile and a nod. It seemed like they were very familiar with most of the people here. After walking for a while, a large locust tree appeared between the bluestone road and the brook, its branches luxuriant and leafy. Under the tree, on a large rock, sat a fisherman in a straw raincoat, fishing in the brook with a fishing rod in his hand. Lu Chen walked over and looked at the fish cage on the ground beside him, and indeed, it was empty. He couldn't help but laugh. "Old you, how many times have I told you, the fish in this brook are too small, they won't grow big, and you can't catch them. If you want to fish, go to the Little Pearl River 5 miles away from the village, or climb up the Tea Mountain, and go to the Dragon Lake in the west, that's where you can catch big fish." The fisherman turned his head to look at him, a white-haired old man, then slowly said, "There are big fish in this brook, I've seen them before." Lu Chen laughed, casually picking up a rock by his feet and throwing it into the brook. With a splash, the water splashed, and immediately rippled. He then said to the old fisherman with a smile, "I've lived here for so many years, but other than the gray stripes in the cracks of the rocks, I've never seen big fish in the water." "You're talking nonsense, aren't you?" The old fisherman didn't get angry, only shaking his head, then repeated, "Little Lu, I'm not lying to you, there really are fish in the water." Lu Chen laughed, as if talking to this fisherman called Old Yu made him very happy. He patted Old Yu's shoulder lightly, then turned and strode away. Only Old Yu was left sitting alone under the big locust tree. After staring blankly for a while, he cast his fishing line again, making an arc in the air before landing in the water, and continued to fish in silence. Walking along the road for another 100 or so feet, he saw a few houses built together. A few green bamboos grew in the corners of the walls, and the last house had a crooked flag hanging diagonally outside. On the flag was the character Jiu, which was almost unrecognizable to others. Lu Chen walked over and casually pushed the door. The door opened, and then a somewhat helpless voice came from inside, saying, "Hey, have you seen anyone's tavern open so early?" Lu Chen walked into the nameless tavern unconcernedly. As expected, he saw that most of the chairs were still upside down on the table, as if they had been closed last night. He didn't stand on ceremony, walking to the window and taking a stool on the ground to sit down. Then he turned back and smiled, saying, "I'm not here to drink." At the side of the tavern's wall, behind the counter, a chubby middle-aged man with a blissful face slowly sat up. He looked at Lu Chen and asked with interest, "Oh? Then I'm curious. If you're not here to drink, then why are you in my tavern?" Lu Chen patted his belly and said, "I've been tired all night, and my stomach is about to flatten. Cook a bowl of noodles to eat." The amiable middle-aged man snorted and said, "I only sell wine, not noodles." Lu Chen laughed and said, "I'm not planning on buying from you. If I don't buy, then I'll have noodles. Go, go." After the time it took to drink a cup of tea, a bowl of hot and fragrant onion and egg noodles was placed in front of Lu Chen. Lu Chen exclaimed in admiration. He picked up the chopsticks and began to eat. As he ate, he said in a muffled voice, "Old Ma, your cooking skills have improved again. This noodles is really good. To be honest, if it weren't for your wine and cooking, I don't know how I could survive here for the past 10 years. Old Ma took a rag from behind the counter and then walked out. He took down the stools from the table and began to wipe them. At the same time, he smiled and said to Lu Chen, "Don't talk nonsense. Even if my wine and food are so bad that even dogs won't touch them, you can still eat them without batting an eyelid." Lu Chen ate the noodles in big mouthfuls, as if he didn't hear what Old Ma said. Old Ma didn't care. He put down the stools in the tavern and cleaned them. When he turned back, there was only an empty bowl on the table in front of Lu Chen. Chapter 9. Lu Chen let out a burp and rubbed his belly in satisfaction. He smiled and said, "The taste isn't bad. It's a good meal." Old Ma glanced at him and put away the bowl. At the same time, he lightly said, "You went to see Ding Dang again last night?" Lu Chen leaned against the wall and casually crossed his legs. He looked at Old Ma and smiled. "What, you're interested in her too?" Old Ma snorted and said, "She's just a prostitute, I'm not interested." Lu Chen rolled his eyes and said, "Prostitutes aren't people. She also wants to live a good life. What's more, she can't just let anyone into her house and bed her. At least in this village, she has to like the person." He smiled and looked at Old Ma and said, "Look at your fat body. Ding Dang definitely won't like you." Old Ma cupped his hands and said, "Many thanks, many thanks. Please don't like me." Lu Chen couldn't help but laugh and scold him with a smile, "You bastard, why are you making things difficult for a woman?" As the two were talking, the outside of the house gradually became lively. As time passed, the warm sun finally rose over the peak of Tea Mountain and shone down on the village at the foot of the mountain. The village seemed to have woken up and was filled with all kinds of sounds. Lu Chen sat in the wine shop and listened for a while. He suddenly said, "These 2 days, the villagers have been busier than usual. Is it almost time for the Thousand Autumns Gate to send people down to collect grain and tea?" Old Ma thought about it and said, "It's about time. Today is the 6th of the 3rd month. In 4 days, which is the 10th of the 3rd month, the Thousand Autumns Gate will send people down." Lu Chen looked happy and said, "They're finally here. If they didn't come, I would have spent all my spirit stones." Old Ma sneered, a look of disdain on his face. In today's world, the immortal path was flourishing in the central divine continent. There were countless cultivation sects, and the immortal cultivation clans and aristocratic families of various sizes had occupied countless paradises, spiritual mountains, and scenic sceneries. They recruited disciples widely and diligently sought the immortal path. Qingshitang village was originally just an ordinary little village. However, 100 years ago, Nansong Mountain, which was about 15 kilometers away from here, was occupied by someone. From then on, they established a sect and called themselves the Thousand-Year Sect. Since then, they had become the most powerful cultivation sect in the area. Because of this, Qingshitang village, which was only 30 miles away from South Pine Mountain, was naturally included in the Thousand Autumn Sect's sphere of influence. At the same time, because it was located on the main road to South Pine Mountain, there were quite a lot of people coming and going. As a result, the village gradually became more prosperous. To the people of the mortal world, Qi refinement cultivators were the equivalent of immortals. Within 1,000 miles, the strongest sect, the Thousand-Year House, was naturally the local tyrant. At the same time, in addition to cultivating their own Tao, cultivators often needed more natural and spiritual materials to support them. Qingshitang village was a place with beautiful mountains, clear waters, fertile soil, and abundant spiritual energy. Thus, the Thousand-Year Sect had developed it into an important production area. The fields in front of the village were planted with spirit grains, and the tea mountain behind the village was filled with spirit tea. At the beginning of every month, people would come to collect the spirit grains and spirit tea. At the same time, they would also distribute spirit stones to those who turned in the spirit grains and spirit tea. Lu Chen leaned against the window of the small tavern, watching the gradually bustling scene of the village and the hopeful faces of the people outside. He suddenly turned around and said to the owner of the tavern who had come out with a jug of wine, "Old Ma, why do you think these people work so hard to grow those things, and then do everything they can to live frugally? Just what do you think they're doing?" Old Ma replied indifferently, "Isn't that obvious? Out there, which one of those people doesn't want to become immortals and become immortals? Don't they work so hard to accumulate spirit stones so that they can go to the 1,000-year sect and see if they have the talent to become immortals?" Lu Chen pursed his lips. The 1,000-year sect is a little unkind. It's just a common test, but they insist on collecting 1,000 spirit stones from each person. How many people have they driven to their deaths? I've seen many people in this village collect 1,000 spirit stones at the age of 50 or 60. Then, they go to the 1,000-year sect and spend all their life savings to see through the mirror. Most of them don't have any talent. The rest might have a bit of talent and could barely cultivate, but they were kicked out because they were too old. Then, some cried like crazy, and their lives were pretty much ruined. Old Ma shrugged and said, "Although this method is not very presentable, it's still passable. At least it's not too ugly. There's no forced enslavement or anything like that. It's already good enough." Lu Chen couldn't help but laugh. He stood up and said with a smile, "It's rare that you would speak up for a sect that doesn't make the cut." Old Ma said indifferently, "Last year, the 1,000-year sect was ranked as a beginner middle rank sect on the list of 10,000 immortals issued by Xianxia. It's no longer a small sect that doesn't make the cut." "What the hell?" Lu Chen was shocked. His eyes widened as he looked at Old Ma. "No way, I don't think this trashy sect is qualified." Old Ma poured himself a cup of wine and said with a smile, "They sent 50,000 spirit stones to True Lord Guangbo, in Xianxia. Of course they're qualified." "Oh." This time, Lu Chen was even more surprised. He looked up and down at the chubby tavern owner in front of him and said with a smile, "My goodness, haven't you been staying with me in this village all these years? How can you be so well informed?" Old Ma smiled but didn't say anything. He just raised his cup to him and drank it in one gulp, with a mysterious smile on his face. Lu Chen looked askance at him and scolded, "You're so sneaky. How many things are you hiding from me?" Old Ma immediately shook his head and said, "Nothing. It's not like you don't know what's going on here." Before he finished speaking, they suddenly heard a loud noise coming from outside. It was so loud that it broke the silence of the village, as if something big had happened. Lu Chen and Old Ma frowned at the same time and looked outside. After a while, Lu Chen said, "It seems to be coming from the entrance of the village." Old Ma said, "You stay here. I'll go and have a look." Lu Chen shook his head and said, "Let's go together." Old Ma wanted to persuade him again, but when he saw Lu Chen's expression, he hesitated and didn't say anything. They walked out of the tavern and walked all the way to the front of the village. On the way, they saw many villagers running in the same direction. Many of them looked surprised and excited, as if they had heard some special news. Chapter 10. Old Ma took 2 steps forward and suddenly saw a familiar villager who frequented the tavern. He quickly grabbed him and asked, "What's going on up ahead? Why is it so noisy?" The villager did not stop and said loudly, "I heard that a few immortal masters from the 1,000 Autumns sect found a demon from the divine sect of the 3 realms who had snuck into the sect. He's now at the entrance of the village." Old Ma's body shook and he unconsciously let go of the villager. After a while, he turned around and looked at Lu Chen who was beside him. He saw that his friend was frowning slightly, his face indifferent, but there seemed to be a strange light in his eyes. Old Ma took a deep breath and said in a low voice, "Let's go back." Lu Chen looked at him and said lightly, "If you turn back now, wouldn't it look even more strange to others?" Old Ma frowned and looked around. Sure enough, almost everyone in the village was walking in the direction of the village entrance. At this time, if only the 2 of them suddenly turned around halfway, it would indeed be a little conspicuous. At this moment, Lu Chen reached out and patted his shoulder, saying, let's go take a look together." As he said that, he walked straight ahead. Behind him, Old Ma sighed helplessly and followed. The two of them walked all the way to the entrance of Qingshitang village. The place was half filled with water and half filled with fields. There was only a path in the middle that led outside. About 300 feet away from the entrance of the village, there were 5 people dressed in similar clothes standing there. One of them had a foot-long wound on his chest. Blood seeped out and dyed half of his body red, but he still held a sharp sword in his hand, as if he had not given up on struggling. The other 4 spread out and surrounded him, also holding sharp swords in their hands. They all looked disdainful and disgusted. Lu Chen and Old Ma stood in an inconspicuous spot in the crowd and watched the scene unfold in front of them. They saw that the 5 people were dressed in the style that the disciples of the Thousand Autumns sect usually wore. The 4 who surrounded them consisted of middle-aged men and young men, while the injured one looked to be in his early 20s. He seemed to be the remnant of the divine sect of the 3 realms that was being hunted down and hunted down. From the corner of his eye, Old Ma looked to his side and saw that everyone was looking at them eagerly and nervously. No one had noticed the 2 of them, so he nudged Lu Chen without saying a word, but his eyes showed a hint of inquiry. Lu Chen stared at the young man for a moment and did not speak. He only shook his head lightly. For some reason, Old Ma suddenly breathed a sigh of relief. At this time, the leader of the 4 from the Thousand Autumns sect, a middle-aged man with a cold expression, pointed his sword at the young man and shouted, "Vile spawn! You're about to die, and you still don't know how to repent?" The young man was heavily injured and his expression changed. He smiled bitterly and said, "Master, I've always been respectful to you and served you well. I've never done anything wrong to you. Why do you still treat me like this?" The middle-aged man heard this and frowned. A hint of hesitation flashed across his face. It seemed that the person in front of him had always been his favorite, but now he was a little hesitant. The young man suddenly fell to his knees and threw away the sword in his hand. He crawled forward and cried to the middle-aged man, "Master, Master, I was wrong, please forgive me." The middle-aged man sighed and the sword in his hand slowly drooped. He sighed and said, "The sect's rules are strict and the League of Immortals has strict orders. There's nothing I can do. You can only blame yourself for walking the wrong path." "Fine, fine. Since we're master and disciple, I will." While he was speaking, the people around him were also listening attentively. However, in a distant corner of the crowd, Lu Chen suddenly snorted softly. Old Ma, who was beside him, was slightly startled and turned to look at him. At this moment, someone suddenly shouted, "Martial uncle, be careful." The middle-aged cultivator's body trembled. Before he could react, the young man who was kneeling in front of him suddenly pulled out a short blade from under his sleeve. The young man's figure burst forward, and he directly stabbed the middle-aged man's abdomen with the short blade. This sneak attack was vicious. Even though the middle-aged man's cultivation was far stronger than the young man's, he was caught off guard and couldn't dodge. However, the middle-aged man's cultivation was extraordinary. With a roar, all the muscles in his body tightened. At the same time, he struck out with his palm and sent the disobedient disciple flying. He staggered back 3 steps and was about to roar when his voice suddenly became hoarse. He looked down and saw that the wound on his abdomen was bleeding black blood. "There's poison on the blade." The other 3 disciples of the Thousand Autumns sect had already rushed forward with angry roars, surrounding the young man and attacking him. The young man was seriously injured. He had already thrown away his long sword, and he did not retrieve his dagger after injuring the middle-aged man. At this moment, he was empty-handed. Under the siege of his 3 former fellow disciples, he could only retreat in defeat. However, there was no fear on his face. Instead, he seemed to have gone mad. He laughed and shouted at the top of his lungs, "The true God has descended and unified the 3 realms. In the future, I will ascend to the ranks of immortals and go." Before he could even finish his sentence, he had already been struck by a ray of sword light and fell to the ground. The disciples of the Thousand Autumns clan who followed closely behind him all looked like they hated this person to the core. They all followed closely behind. Sword lights rained down and in the blink of an eye, blood splattered everywhere. In an instant, this person was reduced to a pile of meat paste in broad daylight. Immediately afterward, the three of them quickly turned around and surrounded the injured middle-aged cultivator. When they saw the wound, they looked at each other with fear on their faces. At this time, the middle-aged man was the calmest. He whispered in a hoarse voice, "Let's go back to the mountain." Only then did the three of them react, and they hurriedly agreed. Then, one of them carried the middle-aged cultivator while the other two protected him, and they dashed away. No one cared about the remnant of the divine sect of the Three Realms anymore. Only a short period of time had passed since they received the news and rushed out to witness the sudden change in the fierce battle. However, the intrigue and fierceness of the battle had greatly shocked the mortals who were watching the battle. After a while, the people at the entrance of the village slowly dispersed. At the same time, among the discussions, most of them were curious about the divine sect of the Three Realms. Many people knew about this. Since it wasn't a secret, they took the opportunity to tell the young people who didn't know much about the divine sect of the Three Realms. The general idea was that the divine sect of the Three Realms was actually a sect with a long history. They believed in the three realms of gods, humans, and ghosts. Chapter 11. It was said that there were many fanatics in the Three Realms divine sect who firmly believed that only by opening the world wall and inviting the true God to descend to the mortal world and unify the three realms would the world be united. Because of this, they did all kinds of strange things and killed a lot of people. They were even given the title of demon sect, and were not tolerated by the world. Many years ago, this sect was labeled as the #1 evil sect by Xianxia and ordered the world to hunt them down. Since then, they have not seen the light of day and turned to secret activities. But these years, it was said that there were many disciples who infiltrated the many cultivation sects in Xianxia and secretly did some sinister things. It was really a big problem for the world's righteous path. The crowd dispersed while discussing. No one cared about the corpse of the remaining member of the Three Realms divine sect. After a while, someone would naturally come to clean it up. Old Ma and Lu Chen were at the back of the crowd and slowly walked into the village. Old Ma said in a low voice, "How was it?" Lu Chen was expressionless and even his tone did not change as he said, "A bunch of lunatics." Walking back to the village, the clear stream, green bamboo, and peach blossoms, as well as the distant green mountains, the tranquil and beautiful scenery seemed to isolate the bloody scene from before. It made people subconsciously feel that the chaos and turmoil was still a long way away. After walking for a while on the bluestone road, Lu Chen suddenly saw a peach tree in front of a fork in the road. The branches were full of tender red, and under the tree stood a beautiful young woman, leaning on the tree. Human face, peach blossom, for a moment he did not know which was more beautiful, but it was Ding Dang. A wind blew and a few petals fell. She stood there in a light dress, as if she was a fairy, as beautiful as a fairy who was not tainted by the mortal world. Many of the villagers who passed by saw this scene, and many of the men turned back. Especially some of the young men had a covetous look in their eyes, but most of them still hurried past, and no one came forward to talk. On this side, Lu Chen said to Old Ma seriously, "In a few days it will be the day to collect the tea. I also have to go collect the goods, you go back first." Old Ma cursed, "Bullshit. Do you think I'm blind?" Lu Chen smiled and said, "Then do you want to come with me to collect the goods?" Old Ma sneered and said, "Don't say that I didn't warn you. Be careful that you don't play yourself to death." With that said, he clasped his hands behind his back and strode away. Lu Chen smiled at Old Ma's back, then walked straight to the peach tree and said with a smile, "What's wrong? I remember that you were sleeping in. Why did you come out to watch the show?" Ding Dang rolled her eyes at him, then looked towards the village entrance and said, "I heard that the commotion outside wasn't right, so I wanted to come out to take a look." In the end, just as I reached here, everyone returned. "What's going on outside?" Lu Chen then told her everything, causing Ding Dang to suck in a breath of cold air, her face revealing a trace of fear as she said, "Ah? Wasn't that person also a disciple of the Thousand Autumns sect?" He had already cultivated immortal arts, How could he die just like that? Lu Chen laughed, using his hand to lightly pat Ding Dong's head. He laughed and said, "What are you saying? On what basis can a cultivator who has cultivated immortal arts and divine arts not die? Go go go." Ding Dong said coquettishly, waving her hand to hit the hand that Lu Chen used to take advantage of her a few times. Then with a look of yearning and melancholy she said, "But, the cultivators that we dream of, isn't it to seek immortality, to ascend and become immortals? It's not easy for us to have this opportunity, we should just peacefully cultivate and live our lives honestly. How can there be so many messy things? Che, you've only seen so much, and you're already sighing here." Lu Chen glanced at her, and said to her, "Let me tell you, you didn't see it just now, but the dead person outside the village was slashed 7 times, 1 sword cut off his hand, 2 swords pierced through his abdomen, 1 sword cut through his ribs, and the other 3 swords slashed his face. Blood splattered everywhere, and in the end, all that was left was a pile of meat paste, no longer recognizable as a person, Aya." Ding Dong's face instantly turned white, her hands covering her ears, no longer caring about her elegant demeanor. She sent a kick towards Lu Chen. "Shut up. Shut up. Shut up. Blarg." Seeing her clutching her chest and about to retch, Lu Chen laughed out loud, then retracted his smile, and said to her with a smile that was not a smile, "If you can't even handle such a small matter, what if you have the chance to enter a sect in the future, then what? Pay." Ding Dong gasped for breath for a while, struggling to free herself from the frightening fantasy, and angrily said to Lu Chen, "Nonsense. What kind of place is an immortal sect? How can it be as frightening as you say it is? Moreover, aren't you immortal yourself, talking for so long here? Be careful that in the future, when an immortal passes by and hears you, they might catch you and harshly punish you." Lu Chen shrugged, and did not say anything more, only smiling. "Forget it, in a few days, the 1,000-year sect will send people down to collect spiritual tea and spiritual grains. I also have to go to the tea mountain to collect some spiritual tea to exchange for spirit stones." Ding Dong's eyes lit up, and said, "How's the harvest recently? How many spirit stones can it be exchanged for?" Lu Chen looked at her, and laughed. "Look at how anxious you are. How many spirit stones have you saved up? How far are you from 1,000? Ding Dong huffed, "This old lady is not going to tell you. In any case, if you have spirit stones then come find me, otherwise get lost." Lu Chen laughed. "I say, nowadays there are quite a lot of people working in Qingshitang village, and most of them are men. As long as you are willing to let go, 1,000 isn't too hard." "Go to hell. Do you think this old lady is such a loose person?" Ding Dong said angrily, but seeing Lu Chen nodding his head, Ding Dong's face reddened, and she could not help but kick him again. "Stinky man, why do you always make me angry? Are you afraid that I won't age fast enough?" Lu Chen jumped away, and smiled. "Spirit stones are things that can't be brought along in life, and can't be taken away in death. I have always spent them casually. But the people working in this village are probably like you, wanting to take a look at the 1,000-year sect's immortal mirror, so even if they are envious of you, no one is willing to go to your door, right?" Ding Dong stopped in her tracks, and snorted, "You know and you still say it? Those shameless people, they only want to take advantage of me all day long. This old lady here has already kicked them out, but in the end, those spineless people all talk bad about me behind my back." After a pause, she could not help but feel a little curious. "Hey, stinky man, I didn't think so before, but now that you mention it, it really does seem a little strange. Why is it that everyone else wants that opportunity, but only you seem to not care?" Lu Chen smiled at Ding Dong, and Ding Dong frowned, suddenly feeling a chill in her heart for no reason. Chapter 12. But Ding Dong's uncomfortable feeling only lasted for a moment. After a while, Lu Chen laughed and waved his hand, saying, "Spirit stones are common, but a beauty like you is not. Now that I have the chance to get intimate with you, I can't let go of this opportunity." Ding Dong's face reddened, and she rolled her eyes at him before turning around to leave. Lu Chen watched as she walked back to the house in the distance, then turned around and continued walking forward. When he reached the large locust tree, he saw that the old fisherman named Old Yu was still sitting under the tree, fishing. It was as if he was the only person in the entire village who didn't care about what happened outside. However, at this time, other than the old fisherman, Old Ma was also standing behind Old Yu. He was looking at the clear stream in front of them and couldn't stop looking. Lu Chen walked over and stood beside Old Ma, saying, "There are no fish in the stream." Old Ma didn't seem surprised at his sudden appearance. Instead, he pointed at the cracks between the pebbles in the clear stream and said seriously, "That's nonsense. Look, there are a lot of fish over there." Lu Chen helplessly looked at the small grayish-black fish that were smaller than a finger and were swimming leisurely at this moment. He sighed and said, "I'm saying that there aren't any big fish in the water that Old Yu wants to catch." Old Ma thought for a moment and said, "You're right." The two of them walked side by the clear stream, feeling the spring breeze on their faces. As they walked, Old Ma suddenly said, "That woman named Ding Dang, if she really gathered 1,000 spirit stones and luckily passed the test of the 1,000 Autumn Gate Immortal Mirror, and became a cultivator of the 1,000 Autumn Gate, what do you think the first thing she would do?" Lu Chen looked at the green mountains in the distance, a smile hanging on his lips. He said, "Oh, diligently cultivating in order to live forever?" Old Ma glanced at him and said, "I think the first thing she would do after gaining cultivation is to sneak back here and kill the man she had a relationship with." Lu Chen laughed and patted Old Ma's shoulder. "Old Ma, why are your thoughts so dark? She's a woman, she didn't do anything to you, why do you hate her so much? Moreover, for those things that have not happened, who can say for sure? If I were to say, maybe after Ding Dang obtains the Tao, she will remember our old relationship and come back to help me cultivate on the mountain. What do you think?" Saying that, he could not help but laugh out loud. Old Ma sneered and ignored him. He took a few more steps forward. Seeing that he had reached the fork in the road leading to the tavern, he suddenly said lightly, "You know I'm right." Lu Chen's footsteps paused for a moment. He walked to the fork and turned to Old Ma and said with a smile, "It's getting late. You go back to your wine shop, I'm going home to sleep." Old Ma stared at him and said, "You've seen more things than me, why do you turn a blind eye to it?" Lu Chen's eyelids slightly drooped. After a moment of silence, he said, "I've seen a lot, so I want to look on the bright side. This way, at least I can live comfortably." He shrugged his shoulders and said, "Otherwise, even if I live, it might be a life worse than death, so it's better to let myself be happy." After speaking, Lu Chen laughed, looking cheerful and happy. He waved to Old Ma beside the spring breeze and under the green bamboo and peach blossoms, then turned and left. Old Ma looked at his back and shook his head. His face gradually revealed some emotions, but he didn't say anything in the end. After leaving Old Ma, Lu Chen walked along the Qingshui stream all the way to the foot of the mountain. He could see a lonely straw hut built at the foot of the mountain. Further away was a deep green pond, which was the source of the Qingshui stream. At this moment, Lu Chen plucked a bamboo leaf from somewhere and chewed it in his mouth. The slightly bitter but refreshing taste stimulated his tongue as he walked leisurely towards the straw hut. However, when he was about 100 feet away from the straw hut, his body suddenly trembled and he suddenly staggered, looking like he almost fell to the ground. Fortunately, there was a peach tree by the side of the road. Lu Chen grabbed the trunk of the peach tree with such force that the peach tree trembled and countless pink petals fell, like a colorful and tempting spring rain. Lu Chen suddenly opened his mouth, the muscles on his face contorted, looking like he was shouting loudly, like a beast roaring after it was injured. However, for some reason, even if he opened his mouth wide, strangely, not a single sound came out from his mouth. Following that, his body started to tremble non-stop, as if at this moment, his entire body was enduring unimaginable pain. Without any warning, in his pair of black eyes, 2 balls of flames suddenly ignited. Black flames. The black flames burned fiercely, just like that night. The black flames suddenly appeared, burning in Lu Chen's eyes. Following that, everywhere on his body under his clothes, strange low and deep sounds seemed to come out at the same time, like the friction of bones, like the wailing of flesh and blood, making one's hair stand on end. Lu Chen took a deep breath, clenched his teeth and then strode towards the straw hut at the foot of the mountain. His footsteps were a little unsteady, as if each step brought him great pain. After just a few steps, one could vaguely see that on some parts of his body that were exposed, his face, neck and hands, strange black stripes faintly appeared, looking like patterns. Like a burning flame. Lu Chen panted, running with big strides. The straw hut in front was getting closer and closer, but the strange scene on his body seemed to be triggered at any moment. Suddenly, on the skin on the back of his neck, a ball of strange black flames suddenly rushed out from under his skin, and then began to burn. In just a blink of an eye, the flesh and skin around the black flames were charred. Lu Chen let out a low roar. His body trembled as if he was on the verge of collapsing. However, his courage and willpower came from an unknown source. Despite the excruciating pain of being burned by the black flames, he still forced himself to not collapse. Instead, he continued to run forward towards the grass hut. As if in that ordinary straw hut, there was a life-saving straw for him. As time passed, Lu Chen's condition worsened with each passing moment. Black flames continued to erupt from every corner of his body. One moment it was on the back of his hand, the next moment it was on his chest, his back, his head, his thighs, his calves, and almost everywhere else. When Lu Chen rushed to the door of the thatched hut, it looked as if his entire body had been devoured by the black flames. He pushed open the door of the hut and rushed in. The door was opened and then closed. He, who was in excruciating pain from being burned by the black fire, suddenly paused for a moment. Then, from somewhere above his head, an inconspicuous gray stalk of grass suddenly floated down. Chapter 13. The stalk of grass was reflected in his eyes that were occupied by the black flames. Lu Chen snorted, then quickly rushed to the only wooden bed in the house, and lay down on it. The wooden bed looked very simple, but it was very flat, and there was a layer of bedding on it. It was unknown where Lu Chen pressed on the bed, but suddenly there was a muffled sound, and the entire bed flipped over, immediately sending Lu Chen under the bed. The thatched hut instantly became silent, empty, and there was no longer any sound. While he was still flipping in midair, Lu Chen, who was already in extreme pain from being burned by the black flames, couldn't help but let out a low roar. When his vision turned black, his body began to involuntarily fall down. He suddenly slapped his right hand heavily on his chest. There was no sound, no movement, that darkness seemed to not move at all, but the falling figure in the darkness, the body that was being burned by the black flames, suddenly disappeared. Disappeared into thin air just like that. In the next moment, a gray light suddenly lit up in front of Lu Chen, and a moment later, his body heavily fell to the ground, making a muffled sound. The black fire was still mercilessly burning his flesh and blood. His body was charred and cracked inch by inch, as if he was about to be burned into a pile of ashes. But at this moment, the place where he was standing had suddenly become a mysterious place that was no more than 20 feet in size and only a few feet in height. This place was surrounded by incomparably thick wood that seemed to be connected together. The surface was overflowing with an ancient aura, mottled and visible, as if countless years had passed. At the same time, there was a misty green gas shrouding it, causing all the wood walls to look somewhat blurry, like an ancient tree hole. And in this tree hole, the ground was only about 2 zhang wide, and in the middle, there was a puddle that took up half of the space, the rest was solid ground. The water in that puddle was clear with a hint of green. It was motionless, and for a moment, it was impossible to see how deep it was. It was like a piece of sparkling and translucent jade. However, there seemed to be an extremely strong and fresh aura coming from that puddle of clear water. At this moment, Lu Chen fell on the ground not far from the puddle, burned by the black flames. He didn't even have the strength to stand up, but lying on the ground, he still struggled with all his strength, and then his body rolled, rolling twice, and with a splash, he fell into that puddle of water. Who? It was a strange sound, suddenly coming from his ears, as if he was isolated from everything in this world, as if he was the only person left in the entire world. The faint water waves shook intensely, countless large and small transparent bubbles floated in front of his eyes, a cool feeling from all directions close to his body, slowly suppressing the terrible burning feeling. This puddle was much deeper than he had imagined, but the size was only so-so. Lu Chen couldn't even straighten his body in the water. He just curled up like a frightened child, hiding in this incomparably quiet water. He let the water flow and wash his body. It was like a gentle hand, comforting his scarred soul. Even in the water, the black flames on Lu Chen's body still didn't extinguish. The black flames were still burning, but as if being suppressed by the strange vitality of this water, the black flames began to gradually wither, and then slowly retracted back into Lu Chen's skin, gradually becoming smaller and weaker, until it quietly disappeared from his body. The water waves surrounded him, and then at a speed visible to the naked eye, the terrible wounds left by the black flames on Lu Chen's body began to quickly recover. Very quickly, everything became as if nothing had happened, except for that extremely tired man. He tightly curled up his body, hiding in the water, for a long time did not show his head. In this quiet water, his lips seemed to be slightly trembling. He clenched his teeth, his face slightly twisted, his face filled with sorrow and pain, as if he wanted to cry, but also as if he was forcibly holding back, forcibly not making a sound. He slowly raised his head, looking up from the water. In that rippling light, there was another blurry world, as if he could never see clearly, nor could he see the end. The next morning, the moon set, the sun rose. When the sunlight once again fell on this quiet little village, just like in the past, the entire village seemed to suddenly wake up and become lively. Lu Chen yawned as he walked out of his straw hut, carefully closed the wooden door, and then walked down the mountain to the village. Old Yu once again sat under the large pagoda tree, fishing for the big fish that he seemed to never be able to find. People came and went in groups of 2s and 3s, laughing and chatting loudly. Most of the topics they talked about were the people from the Thousand Autumns sect who would be coming down to collect the spirit tea and spirit grains in a few days. There were also some bits and pieces of information about the massacre at the village entrance yesterday. After listening for a while, Lu Chen felt a little bored, and he also felt a little hungry, so he habitually walked to the small tavern. Although this time was a little later than yesterday, Old Ma clearly had no intention of opening the door for business. The tavern's door was still closed. However, to Lu Chen, this was of course not a problem. He walked over and knocked on the door twice, then laughed loudly. Old Ma, open the door for business. After a while, footsteps sounded from inside the house, and someone walked to the door and opened it with a creak, revealing Old Ma's slightly plump body. Lu Chen smiled and patted Old Ma's shoulder, saying, "I'm hungry, cook something for me to eat." As he said this, he walked straight past Old Ma, but then he heard a light cough from Old Ma. Lu Chen's eyes narrowed slightly, sweeping across the small tavern, and then he saw a figure sitting at a table in front of him, this early in the morning. It was an old man who looked to be in his early 50s, with gray hair and a warm smile on his face, and even nodded when he saw Lu Chen. Old Ma closed the door behind him, inserted the door bolt, then walked to Lu Chen's side and said softly, "Inspector Lu just arrived here this morning." Lu Chen nodded, walked over and smiled at the old man, looking like they were actually very close, and he even patted the old man's shoulder, saying with a smile, "Old man Lu, don't you come here once a year? I remember that the last time you came to Qingshitang village was only half a year ago. Why, do you miss me?" Ha 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 ha. This old man with the surname Lu looked very amiable, and he smiled at Lu Chen, saying, "Little Lu, you really know how to joke, but this is a routine inspection under the orders of Hall Master Shui, so I came over to say hello to both of you." Chapter 14. Jokes aside, looking at old Lu's half-serious smile, Lu Chen said with a straight face, "What is it?" Inspector Lu smiled and said, "I'm not young anymore. 3 months ago, I met with an accident during an inspection and got injured in a fight. Thinking about it, I've worked in the Immortal Alliance for decades, so I thought it'd be better for me to retire at home." Lu Chen was slightly surprised and said in shock, "There's such a thing?" Inspector Lu smiled and said, "Isn't that so? In the future, the Immortal Alliance and Fuyunji's Hall Master Shui will send people to deal with the corresponding matters. I'll be returning to the Immortal Alliance in a few days. After finishing the last bit, I'll retire and return to my hometown. Little Lu, we've known each other for 10 years. Let's say our goodbyes today. I hope we'll meet again in the future. Lu Chen nodded and cupped his hands. Thank you for taking care of me all these years, Inspector Lu. I can't thank you enough. Inspector Lu laughed and chatted with Lu Chen for a while. Then, he stood up and said goodbye. Lu Chen and Old Ma sent him to the door. After he left, Lu Chen watched Old Ma close the door. His fat face seemed to be solemn. Suddenly, he smiled and said, "Why do you look like you have something on your mind?" Old Ma glanced at him and said, "Aren't you worried at all?" Lu Chen waved his hand and said, "Didn't I tell you yesterday? The most important thing to do is to be open-minded. Don't take everything to heart. That way, you can live a more comfortable life. Tell me, what's the matter?" The higher-ups said that they'll deduct the number of spirit stones you get every month. Bang! A loud sound startled Old Ma. Lu Chen slammed the table and stood up. His face was full of anger and he shouted, "Damn it! Which bastard dares to mess with me?" Old Ma gave him a sidelong glance. Lu Chen glanced at him and snorted, "Why are you looking at me?" Old Ma gloated, "The bastard you scolded is perfected Lord Tianlan." Lu Chen was stunned for a moment and then became angry. He said, "What's so great about a perfected lord? Is that old man going to break his promise and turn against me?" Old Ma coughed a couple of times and said, "The 6 perfected lords of the Immortal Alliance are all peerless figures with remarkable abilities. You've directly called out the perfected lord's name. Maybe he can sense it?" Lu Chen sneered and said, "So what if I scolded him?" "Tianlan old man, you're an old man with short legs and long arms, fatter than a pig, full of evil tricks, and bald head." Old Ma was dumbfounded and couldn't say a word for a long time. Lu Chen looked around and saw that the tavern was quiet. It didn't look like something would suddenly happen. He said to Old Ma, "Look, either that old man Tianlan can't hear me, or he sensed that I was scolding him, but he didn't dare make a sound." Old Ma smiled bitterly and said, "Little Lu, it's not good for you to be like this." Lu Chen rolled his eyes and said, "He's going to deduct my spirit stones, and you're blaming me for falling out? Didn't you say that you would let me live a comfortable life?" Old Ma said sternly, "I was there that day too. I don't remember Senior Immortal saying this." Lu Chen said angrily, "Then who said that?" "I remember it very clearly." Old Ma pointed at Lu Chen's chest and said, "You said it yourself." Lu Chen looked at Old Ma suspiciously, then waved his hand and said, "Forget it, who can remember things from 10 years ago so clearly? Let's not talk about it for now. In any case, deducting my spirit stones won't do." Old Ma sighed and said, "I just asked. In fact, you're not the only one deducted. All the shadows under Fuyunji are the same." Lu Chen was startled and suddenly stopped talking. His eyes flickered for a moment, then he stared at Old Ma. Old Ma felt a little uncomfortable under his gaze and looked away. After a while, Lu Chen's previous anger and ruckus seemed to have vanished without a trace, and he seemed abnormally calm. After a long time, he suddenly said, "Damned old man, have you been forced into a difficult position?" Old Ma smiled and looked a little bleak. He said, "Senior Immortal had no choice. Zhengxianmeng has been passed down for more than 3,000 years. It has a big business and countless talents, but it is also full of countless flies and dogs. Therefore, the spirit stones are always not enough to spend. Fuyunji doesn't produce, and we don't see its head. It only says that it will take care of the heroes who have made great contributions to the Immortal Alliance, but it doesn't explain any details. It is equivalent to spending such a huge amount of money every year with empty words. Many people in the Immortal Alliance have long been unhappy with it." Lu Chen was silent. After a while, he shook his head gently and didn't say anything. Old Ma glanced at him, walked to his side, sat down, and said in a low voice, "In the end, you and I both know that Senior Immortal feels guilty towards you. If possible, he doesn't want to make you feel wronged. But if he doesn't deduct your share, it will be highlighted. At that time, if it attracts the attention of people with ulterior motives." At this point, Old Ma paused and said, Fuyunji is under the banner of Senior Immortal Tianlan in the Immortal Alliance, but there are a lot of hall masters, supervisors, inspectors, and monitors. All these years, only Senior Immortal and I know your real identity. Even Inspector Liu, who has been secretly patrolling for 10 years, and even Hall Master Shui, who is in charge of the affairs, don't know the inside story. They only think that you are the kind of people who have made some small contributions and then entered Fuyunji to eat and wait for death. Lu Chen suddenly grinned and said, "Old man Lu hasn't been bad to me all these years, but he doesn't have much respect for me either. Where did you find out about my identity?" Old Ma forced a smile again and shook his head with a sigh. Logically speaking, even this identity shouldn't have been revealed. But now this immortal alliance looks famous, but inside, it is like a sieve filled with water. So this is also what Senior Immortal is worried about. Lu Chen was silent for a while, and suddenly said lightly, "Those people are still investigating?" Old Ma hesitated for a while, but still nodded and said, "Yes." That battle back then could be said to have hurt the foundation of the evil cult. Not to mention the destruction of the god's subduing spell, the most important thing is that 3 out of 5 elders are gone. This hatred is a blood feud that can't be solved. These few years, we have caught some evildoers of the evil cult. After interrogation, when they asked about this, they all said that the evil cult has secretly sent countless people into the Immortal Alliance and the major cultivation sections. Their first priority is to investigate that matter back then. They must dig out the culprit, then tear the body into pieces, and extract the soul to refine the spirit for revenge. Lu Chen snorted and said to Old Ma, "You can just say revenge. You don't have to say the words tear the body into pieces and extract the soul to refine the spirit." Old Ma laughed and said, "Wouldn't it be more imposing to add a few more words?" "Bah!" Lu Chen spat angrily, and then said, "Go cook the noodles." Old Ma said in surprise, "You just said a lot of vicious killers will tear your body into pieces, and you still want to eat noodles?" Lu Chen squinted at him and said, "Don't talk nonsense. I have a fire in my heart. If you don't cook noodles for me, I will smash your tavern." Chapter 15. In Old Ma's heart, this tavern was obviously more important than a bowl of noodles. Hence, when Lu Chen opened the tavern door again and left, he was already rubbing his belly and burping. Qingshitang village was much livelier than usual during the day. This was because the harvest day was approaching and everyone was starting to get busy. Speaking of which, although the village's specialty spiritual tea and spiritual grains had the word spiritual in them, they were actually not spiritual materials that were of great help to cultivators in their cultivation of the immortal Tao. The real treasures of heaven and earth, which could reach the level of immortal treasures, would have special and complete spirit patterns on them. These were the roots of the 5 elements of heaven and earth gathered in them, which gave them all kinds of strange, incredible, and miraculous functions. On a spiritual material, whether it was a spiritual herb, a spiritual ore, a spiritual beast, or a spiritual elixir, the more spiritual patterns it had, the higher the grade of the spiritual material. In the cultivation world, it was commonly known as a 1-stripe spiritual material, 2-stripe spiritual material, and so on. Generally speaking, even the most ordinary 1-stripe spiritual material possessed extremely powerful effects and was extremely valuable. Moreover, the higher the grade of spiritual material, the more spiritual markings they possessed. Not only were they extremely rare, their value was immeasurable, and they had always been sought after and fought over by the cultivators in the world. As for the spiritual tea and spiritual grains produced in Qingshitang village, the reason why they could be purchased by a cultivation sect like Thousand Autumns sect was because these items actually had spiritual inscriptions on them. However, the spiritual inscriptions here were incomplete and incomplete. They contained spiritual energy, but their functions were only average. In fact, there were a lot of things in the world that were above ordinary items but below the formal spiritual tattoos and spiritual materials. Some of them were useless, but some could be slightly beneficial to cultivators. Therefore, some cultivation sects would send people to buy them. Lu Chen had lived in Qingshitang village for many years and had always said that he was selling spiritual tea. In reality, He really did have 2 acres of tea field on the tea mountain behind the village. He had bought it when he first came here. Of course, Lu Chen didn't know how to plant spirit tea trees at all. The weeds in the field were overgrown, and the harvest was only so-so. It was just a cover for the fact that he could take spirit stones from Old Ma for free every month and wait for his death. Therefore, when Lu Chen saw the excited and hopeful people bustling around the village, he felt a little emotional in his heart. Compared to these people, the deduction of some spirit stones did not seem to be too sad. Whether this was self-deception or an excuse to make himself happier, Lu Chen's mood improved a little. He walked leisurely and unknowingly approached the entrance of the village. When he came to his senses, he had already seen the road outside the village. However, he realized that the corpse from yesterday had disappeared. There was only a dark brown dried blood stain left on the road. After a few days of people coming and going, perhaps even the blood stain would disappear. Lu Chen stared at the blood stain for a moment, then turned around and walked back to the village expressionlessly. He walked along the bluestone road and saw the old fisherman sitting under the tree fishing when he was about 10 feet away from the big locust tree. He laughed and wanted to go over to take another look. Suddenly, he heard a commotion on the other side of the stream. Lu Chen was a little surprised and turned to look at the other side of Qingshatang village. Qingshatang village flowed through Qingshatang village. There were houses on both sides of the stream, but the east bank where Lu Chen was at was more crowded. About 70% of the people in the village were there. There were also many pubs, inns, and miscellaneous shops here. On the other side of the west bank, there were probably only a few inconspicuous houses and it was usually quiet. Today was a strange day. There was actually some commotion coming from the other side of the river. Lu Chen looked in that direction and saw that there was a group of people gathered under a cluster of green bamboo on the west bank. There were both men and women, but there were quite a number of women. Some of the women that he usually saw in the village seemed to have run over there. This made Lu Chen a little curious. He walked over to a stone bridge not far in front of him, intending to see what was going on. After getting off the stone bridge, there was a group of people not far away. Before he got close, Lu Chen could hear gasps of admiration coming from the crowd. Among them, there were many gasps of surprise from the women, as if they had seen something incredible. Lu Chen was even more curious. He hurriedly walked a few steps to the side of the crowd. He found a corner with fewer people and looked in. He was instantly stunned. The crowd had formed a semicircle. Under a cluster of green bamboo, there was a young man who looked like a scholar standing with a smile. In front of him was a wooden board with a piece of white paper pasted on it. There was a brush in his hand, but he was drawing. The scholar's appearance was very charming. He didn't look very old, not even 20 years old. Looking at his jade-like face as he held an ink brush in his hand, he was really charming. Lu Chen could even feel the strange affection in the eyes of some of the older aunties around him. But of course, what made the crowd exclaim was not just this person's appearance and charm. This young man was drawing a woman on the paper at this moment. Although it was just black and white ink, it was actually vivid and lifelike. The woman in the painting stood under the flowers, looking at each other with a gaze full of affection. Although the affection was not spoken, it was vividly written on the paper. This painting was actually extremely good. Although Lu Chen didn't understand painting, he felt that it was amazing. Just as he was exclaiming in his heart, he was suddenly startled. He realized that the woman in the painting was actually somewhat familiar. Looking carefully, it was clearly Ding Dang. His heart moved. He immediately turned his head to look at his surroundings. Indeed, not long later, he saw Ding Dang standing there with a strange expression on her face. Her cheeks were slightly red, as if she was angry, but also seemed to be unable to contain her joy. The surrounding girls all turned to look at Ding Dang. The jealousy in their eyes could not be hidden. Not long later, the young man had already finished drawing. He then smiled and took down the painting. He smiled and showed it to the crowd, immediately causing them to cheer. Although this painting could not be considered a big deal, everyone could see that this painting was good or bad. Adding the young man's gentleness and politeness, they naturally liked it. In the crowd, Ding Dang snorted and said, "The painting is not bad, but you are not honest. Why did you have to draw me?" The young man smiled and said, "This elder sister's words are too serious. This young man was just casually drawing. I saw that elder sister is beautiful and drew it. If elder sister does not like it, you can take it away and tear it. Actually, there is no scenery or people in the world that cannot be drawn. If everyone is interested, when this young man has free time, I can also draw one for everyone." Chapter 16. The crowd immediately cheered, especially the girls who were the happiest. Ding Dang was happy at first, but then she became angry. She snorted and said angrily, "Flowery words." The young man smiled and shook his head. He walked over and handed the painting to Ding Dang. He smiled at her and turned to leave. Ding Dang looked at the young man's back as he left. She wanted to say something, but then she suddenly heard someone in the crowd say coldly, "Vixen, trying to seduce men again." The crowd immediately quietened down. Many people laughed. There were both men and women. The men laughed in a more vulgar manner, while the women laughed more acrimoniously. The sound of the women's laughter was louder than the men's. Ding Dong's mouth twitched and her face darkened. She suddenly turned around and walked away. She quickly walked over the stone bridge and crossed the east bank. It seemed like she was going home. Lu Chen stood at the back of the crowd and calmly watched this scene. He then looked at the scholar who had already walked into another small path on the west bank. He then muttered to himself in a low voice, "How annoying. Why is it that young and handsome gigolos are more popular everywhere I go?" The painter and the person being painted had both left. The surrounding crowd naturally dispersed as well. When they left, there were many discussions. Many of them talked about the scholar, praising his handsome appearance and powerful painting skills. There were also many who talked about Ding Dang. They all laughed at her shameless flirting. They then began to worry for the young scholar, hoping that he would not be harmed by the vixen again. Lu Chen walked back to the east bank and yawned in boredom. Then, he strolled over to the large pagoda tree and glanced at the fish cage next to Old Yu. As expected, it was empty. He sat down on the other side of the big rock and asked, "Old Yu, did you catch any fish today?" "No." The old fisherman did not seem to hear the malicious intent in his words and replied honestly. Lu Chen laughed and said to him, "I think you will never be able to catch any fish in this stream in your lifetime." The old fisherman was silent for a moment. Then, like countless times before, he replied woodenly, "There are fish in the water." Tch. Lu Chen stared at him. After a moment, he suddenly lost interest. There really were all kinds of weird people in this world. He said, "Up to you. If you say there is, then there is. Serves you right for wasting your life here. In the end, even if you catch it, it will still be a waste." Every time they reached this point, the two of them would have nothing else to say. But one day, for some reason, Old Yu suddenly turned to look at Lu Chen and said slowly, "No, that's not it. I saw that there were spirit marks on that big fish. As long as I catch it and offer it to the immortals of the Thousand Autumns sect, I can cultivate too." A big fish with spiritual marks. Lu Chen couldn't help but laugh. Then he said, "Oh, if you really catch, this fish is worth more than 1,000 spirit stones. It's enough for you to enter Thousand Autumn sect. But you don't get eaten by." Old Yu looked at Lu Chen strangely and mumbled, "Fish don't eat people." Lu Chen smiled and leaned over to pat him on the shoulder. He did not say anything else. He glanced at the crystal clear stream and got up to leave. At this time, the sun had already risen and shone on Qingshitang village. The Qingshitang stream shimmered, and the large locust trees shaded the sun. It was very cool and refreshing. Only small pieces of the sun fell through the gaps in the leafy canopy. Lu Chen took 2 steps outside. Just as he was about to leave, a ray of sunlight suddenly flickered under the shade of the tree. It was as if a shadow had flashed in a certain corner of the large pagoda tree. Lu Chen's body suddenly stopped. He turned and looked in that direction, only to see that it was just one of the roots of the big locust tree. A part of the roots bulged out of the ground, gripping the soil tightly. At the same time, there was a lot of green grass growing around the trunk and roots. Lu Chen's expression was a little strange. His brows were slightly furrowed, as if he was thinking about something. He was a little confused, a little nervous, and a little disgusted. But very quickly, he calmed down and his expression returned to normal. Then, he walked over to that spot and kicked his feet as if nothing had happened. He took off one of his shoes as if he was going to shake off the soil on the roots. His eyes quickly scanned the area. The shadow seemed to flicker in front of him again. This time, Lu Chen saw it clearly. It was a somewhat strange pattern. It was a little scribbled, as if it was randomly carved in an inconspicuous place between the roots. In the drawing was a circle and a few lines of different thickness. When they came together, it vaguely looked like a simple and strange tree. The wound on the bark looked like it had been cut not long ago. It could not have been more than a day old. Lu Chen's expression slowly turned cold. He got up and put his shoes back on. Then, he walked back to the big rock and glanced at old Yu, who was still fishing quietly. Then, he lay down. He lay behind the old fisherman and closed his eyes. The sound of the flowing stream and the faint sound of the wind blowing the leaves above his head began to reach his ears. Everything seemed to quiet down, as if life in this village had been so peaceful for many years. Then, he suddenly opened his mouth and broke the silence. "Old Yu, let me ask you something." "Oh." The old fisherman said woodenly. "You have been here for the past 2 days, right?" "Yes," the old fisherman said. Lu Chen pillowed his hands behind his head and looked at the green canopy above his head, as well as the broken sun peeking through the gaps between the leaves. "Has anyone else come here?" "No," old Yu said. "You know, other than you and old Ma, no one in the village likes to talk to me." Lu Chen grunted and said lightly, "I thought there were more newcomers in the village recently. Maybe you would make some new friends." "Hee hee." Old Yu chuckled in a low voice, just like the little gray fish in the stream beside him bubbling and then bursting. Lu Chen turned over and sat up. Then, he patted his butt and walked away without another glance at old Yu. After leaving the big locust tree, he first walked a few steps towards the straw hut at the foot of the mountain, but then he stopped and thought for a moment. Then, he turned around and walked back the way he came. At this moment, a man walked towards him. When he saw Lu Chen, he cupped his hands and asked politely, "Brother, may I ask if this mountain behind you is Tea Mountain?" Lu Chen glanced at him and saw that he was also a young man. He carried a long sword on his back and wore a cloak. His face looked travel-worn, as if he had come a long way. Looking at his appearance and attire, he looked like an ordinary itinerant cultivator who traveled the world in search of Dao. Chapter 17. When asked about the situation at the back of the mountain, Lu Chen nodded and said, "Yes, are you going to the Tea Mountain?" A hint of joy appeared on the young man's face as he nodded his head. Then, he clasped his hands together and smiled at Lu Chen. "Excuse me for asking, but do you know of a place called the Flying Swallow Rock on the Tea Mountain?" Lu Chen was stunned for a moment and shook his head. "No, I've lived here for a long time and I'm very familiar with this Tea Mountain. There's no place called Flying Swallow Rock." The young man was stunned too. Obviously, he didn't expect to hear such an answer. He mumbled subconsciously, "That can't be. She was talking about the Tea Mountain in Qingshidang village." Lu Chen smiled. "Maybe. Anyway, this is Qingshidang village and the Tea Mountain. I've never seen the Flying Swallow Rock before. Why don't you go up the mountain and look for it yourself?" The young man thought about it and nodded. "That's true." Lu Chen turned his body and made way for him. He pointed to the green mountain behind him and said, Follow this stone path along the stream and you'll reach the foot of the mountain. Then, there are about a dozen mountain paths that can lead you up the mountain. You can pick any one. More than a dozen mountain paths? The young man seemed to be taken aback. Lu Chen smiled. Half of the front of the mountain has been planted with spiritual tea. People come and go, so of course there are many paths. The young man finally understood and smiled. No wonder it's called Tea Mountain. Thank you. He walked forward as he spoke. Lu Chen watched him walk past him. After taking a glance at his back, he turned around and continued walking forward. He had only taken a few steps when he suddenly heard a call from behind him. It was the young man's voice. Big brother, wait a moment. It's only been a while and you've changed from a brother to a big brother? Lu Chen smiled and turned around. He did not feel annoyed. Instead, he looked curiously at the young man who was running over from the bluestone path in the distance. He smiled and asked, "What's wrong?" The young man had an apologetic look on his face. Before he could say anything, he cupped his hands and bowed to Lu Chen. Lu Chen smiled and waved his hand. You don't have to be so polite. You've been very polite since the beginning. Could it be that you're a disciple of the Kunlun party? The young man was taken aback. He subconsciously took a step back and said in astonishment, "How did you know?" This time, it was Lu Chen who was stunned for a moment. He then looked at the young man and said in surprise, "Could it be true?" The young man paused for a moment, seeming to be a little hesitant, but then he nodded and cupped his hands together, saying, "I am Hong Chuan, a disciple of the Kunlun party. May I know your name, and how did you know my background?" Lu Chen frowned slightly, then smiled bitterly and said, "It was just a random guess." The Kunlun party was very famous in the divine central continent. It could be considered one of the famous sects in the cultivation world. This famous cultivation sect was famous for two things. First, it had a very long history. Zhengxianmeng, which was made up of many cultivation sects, had a history of more than 3,000 years. During this time, countless sects rose and fell. There were only two sects that could stay in Zhengxianmeng and had a longer history than the Immortal Alliance. The Kunlun party was one of them. As for the second most famous thing, it was because it had a very long history. This cultivation sect had a lot of rules and regulations, and paid particular attention to etiquette and rules. Therefore, the disciples of this sect, regardless of their level of cultivation, naturally paid particular attention to etiquette. As the saying goes, 3 points of etiquette when meeting someone. When it came to the disciples of the Kunlun party, it would at least become 5 points of etiquette or 7 points of etiquette. Hong Chuan seemed to have some self-awareness of his own sex characteristics. After hearing Lu Chen's question, he also laughed heartily. Then, he naturally cupped his fists together and said, "I have yet to ask for this big brother's great name." Lu Chen waved his hand and said with a smile, "You are a disciple of a famous sect, and I am just a country bumpkin. How can I bear these 4 words? I am Lu Chen." Hong Chuan said, "Oh." He actually thanked him for asking for directions just now. Lu Chen was a little amused by him and said with a smile, "Why are you back again? Is there anything else you want to ask?" Hong Chuan nodded and said, "Indeed. Brother Lu, I just thought of something. The Flying Swallow Rock was also told to me by someone else, but that person also happened to pass by here many years ago, so the name of the place might not necessarily be the same as today. I just want to ask you, is there a place on this mountain where many red-billed scarlet swallow live?" Red-billed scarlet swallow? Lu Chen thought for a moment and said, "I have never heard of this kind of swallow, but according to what you said, I have thought of a place." Hong Chuan was overjoyed and hurriedly asked, "May I ask where that is? Can you tell me?" Lu Chen pondered for a moment, then said, "The front of Tea Mountain is flat and filled with tea gardens, but the back of the mountain is a bit steep. It's also divided into 2 foothills, the east and west. There's a high lake on the west foot of the mountain, while there's a rarely seen sinkhole on the east foot of the mountain. Every time dusk falls, there will be thousands of rock swallows flying out of the sinkhole in search of food. Speaking up to here, Lu Chen paused and said, that place is probably a little similar to what you said, but the local villagers call that place, Ghost Crying Cave. I have never heard of anyone talking about the Flying Swallow Rock. At this time, Hong Chuan's face was already full of joy. He nodded repeatedly and bowed deeply to Lu Chen, saying, "Thank you for your guidance, Big Brother Lu. I can't thank you enough." He thanked Lu Chen again after he finished speaking, then turned around and strode away. Lu Chen smiled and watched Hong Chuan stride in the direction of Tea Mountain. After pondering for a moment, he turned back and walked into the depths of the village. Not long after, he returned to the small tavern. At this moment, the doors and windows of the small tavern were already open. Obviously, it was open for business. However, Lu Chen glanced inside and found that the tavern was empty. There was not a single customer. Obviously, business was slow. He smiled and stepped in. At this moment, Old Ma was sitting behind the counter. His eyes were dull and he seemed to be in a daze. When he heard the footsteps, he hurriedly stood up and showed a trace of joy on his face. He opened his mouth and said, "Guest, please sit. What would you like to drink?" Before he could say the word, wine, he saw Lu Chen's face appear in front of him. Old Ma's face immediately sank. He snorted and said, "Sit anywhere." Lu Chen laughed and said, "You are so unreasonable. Am I not a guest? It's fine if you don't entertain me, but you won't even give me a smile?" Old Ma sneered and said, "If you are willing to pay the bill, I will smile for you all day long." Chapter 18. Pfft, you're not a woman. Isn't it disgusting enough to smile at me for the whole day? Lu Chen snorted, then leaned on the counter casually, his body slightly leaning forward. Old Ma glanced at him, frowned slightly, and asked in a low voice, "What's wrong?" Lu Chen lowered his voice and whispered a few words. Even in the quiet tavern, his voice could not be heard clearly. Perhaps only Old Ma, who was closest to him, could hear it clearly. As Old Ma listened, his face suddenly darkened. He slowly straightened his body, and after a moment of silence, looked at Lu Chen again, and said, "Are you sure?" Lu Chen said indifferently, "I've seen everything that happened in there back then." Old Ma nodded, and then asked in a low voice, "What's the level of the secret code?" Lu Chen frowned, and after a moment of silence, he said, "This is a strange place. The secret code only has 1 tree and 2 leaves. At most, it's the position of commander in the evil cult." Old Ma's expression relaxed slightly, and he pondered, "It seems that they're not looking for you. Maybe there's also a demon from the 3 realms divine cult here, and they're here to summon them?" Lu Chen snorted, and said, "That's too much of a coincidence." Old Ma nodded, and said, "I understand. I'll find out more about it, don't worry." But didn't the Thousand Autumns sect just kill a demon from the evil cult? Maybe the evil cult demons are here for that? Lu Chen shrugged, and said, "I hope so. Anyway, you keep an eye on this matter." Old Ma said, "Don't worry." Lu Chen stood up and prepared to leave, but before he took a step, he suddenly stopped, and then turned to Old Ma, and said, "There's another thing, help me check it out." Old Ma said, "What?" Lu Chen said, "There seems to be a new young scholar on the other side of the stream. His appearance is handsome, and his drawing skill is good. I have never seen him before. Find out who that man is." Old Ma replied with an, "Oh," and said, "Got it. It's just a small matter." The sky was dark, and the night was quiet. Another night came, and the small mountain village fell into a deep sleep again. It was especially quiet under the cover of darkness. Lu Chen was lying on the bed in his straw hut. The room was pitch black. He closed his eyes, but he couldn't sleep. When people were quiet, they would unintentionally or unintentionally think of some past events. Those thoughts were not completely controlled by people, so even if it was something that they did not want to recall, they would still inadvertently recall it. It wasn't a dream, but when he closed his eyes, it felt like a nightmare that was hard to wake up from. There were mournful shouts, angry screams, ice-cold sword light, and terrifying pain. Of course, most of all, there were those wildly dancing black flames. He opened his eyes in the darkness, shook his head, shook off those disgusting memories, and turned over. There was the sound of the wind outside the straw hut. It was the mountain wind blowing from the tea mountain, and it seemed to be a bit hurried this night. Lu Chen listened for a while, and seemed to hear some noise inside. Some small, faint noise. He turned over and got off the ground, put on his clothes, and walked out. Only then did he find that the night sky was a bit cloudy, and only a few stars were flashing in the distance, making the night look a bit gloomy. The mountain wind whistled past, bringing with it a bit of coldness. Lu Chen turned around and saw the shadows on the mountain peak twisting. It was pitch black, and there was a constant rustling sound, mixed with the wind, drifting over. There was no fear or surprise on Lu Chen's face. He just stared at the mountain peak for a while, and then his gaze moved up, looking at the top of the tea mountain. Although those strange sounds sounded somewhat frightening and gloomy, they were actually the special sound of the leaves and branches trembling when the mountain wind blew through the countless spirit tea trees on the mountain. In the gloomy and silent night, it was like the cry of ghosts, but in reality, it had no meaning. Lu Chen was also not the slightest bit afraid. He just stared in the direction of the eastern foot of the tea mountain, and after a while, he said to himself, "Those swallows don't seem to be moving tonight?" He had lived here for 10 years, and was indeed very familiar with this tea mountain, including the giant pit that the local villagers called the Ghost Wailing Cave. He had also gone up to see it. The giant pit was not small, and it looked quite spectacular from top to bottom. There were indeed hundreds and thousands of swallows living on the rock walls, but whether they were the red-billed red-feathered swallows mentioned by Hong Chuan today, Lu Chen did not know. In Lu Chen's impression, that group of swallows should be just ordinary birds, and not spiritual beasts with spiritual tattoos. Therefore, it was reasonable to say that a disciple of a famous sect like the Kunlun party would generally not be interested in such useless things. Or perhaps, there was some hidden treasure in the giant pit that attracted a disciple of a famous sect like Hong Chuan to peep at it? Thinking of this, Lu Chen's heart also moved, but then he shook his head. He had no intention of being nosy. For the sake of safety, he had explored that area before, but he did not find any so-called heaven and earth treasure. Anyway, even if there was, it was someone else's opportunity. Thinking of this, he planned to go back to sleep. However, just as he pushed open the door of the straw hut, he suddenly heard a low rumble from somewhere in the night. The sound was not soft. Although it was not sharp and ear-piercing, it traveled very far in the night. Lu Chen's body paused, and he turned around to look at the source of the sound. However, he found that the place where the sound came from was pitch black, and it was coming from the deep pool at the foot of the mountain. Lu Chen frowned slightly, and he was a little surprised. The deep pool was located at the foot of the tea mountain, and its depth was unpredictable. This was because from 6 feet underwater, the water temperature became abnormally cold, and ordinary people could not bear it. Therefore, no one had ever been able to dive into it. For many years, this deep pool had been quietly hiding in the depths of the mountain village. Qingshui stream originated from here, and it meandered through the village, coexisting harmoniously with this small mountain village for many years. Lu Chen thought about it, and still walked towards the pool. Not long after, he walked to the edge of the pool. He opened his eyes, and after a moment, he suddenly let out a huh. With the faint starlight in the sky, he saw that there was actually a person floating in the pool. It was the middle of the night, and suddenly, a person was floating on the surface of the deep pool. It was indeed a little scary. At the same time, the mountain wind was mournful, and it blew non-stop. It seemed to add a bit of eerie atmosphere to the place. However, Lu Chen seemed to be completely unaware of this gloomy atmosphere. Instead, he frowned as he stared at the human figure that was bobbing up and down in the water. After a while, he suddenly muttered, "Why does he look a little familiar?" Chapter 19. In other words, you didn't sleep in the middle of the night, and when you woke up to feel the cold wind and listen to ghosts, you saw and saved a Kunlun party disciple who was almost drowned in the pool? In the tavern, Old Ma looked at Lu Chen with an unfriendly expression and said unhappily. The morning light shone through the tavern's window and fell on Lu Chen's face. He thought for a moment and nodded. That's about it. Old Ma spat and sneered. Do you know your identity? Especially when you just found someone in the village engraved the Devil's Sect's secret mark. Damn it. Can't you be a little more honest? Speaking up to here, he suddenly froze and then looked up and down at Lu Chen, a trace of suspicion on his face. Could it be, you thought of Lord Tianlan? So, of course not. Who has the time to care about that damn old man? Lu Chen said with a smile, it's a human life after all. Old Ma sneered and said, bullshit, don't pretend in front of me. Tell me, why didn't you just let that idiot drown and be done with it? Lu Chen coughed dryly and then said with a sigh, Old Ma, you've been very vicious recently. Why do you want people to die so easily? I think it's a sign that your yin and yang are out of balance and your qi is not in harmony. How about this, you bring me 3 spirit stones and I'll help you talk to Miss Ding Dang and let her treat you. Old Ma flew into a rage and shouted, nonsense. Ding Dang only needs 2 spirit stones a night and you actually want to cheat me. Lu Chen was shocked and stood up to look at Old Ma and said, damn it. How do you know so clearly? Old Ma's chubby face turned slightly red and then he regained his composure. After a snort, he poured himself a cup of wine and drank it. Then he said lightly, I don't know what's going on in this village. Lu Chen looked at him suspiciously and said, but why do I feel that there's something strange about you? Blame your head. Old Ma reprimanded him and then decisively changed the topic, saying, about that evil cult's secret record, I have swept through the village once. The old people should not be a problem. Among the newcomers recently, there are about 3 or 4 people who are a little suspicious. I will keep a close eye on them. Lu Chen nodded and said, then keep an eye on them. Tell me if there's anything. Old Ma continued, as for the young man on the other side of the stream you mentioned yesterday, I've looked into him. His name is Li Ji, and he's not affiliated with any sect. He's a mortal who yearns for the path of cultivation. He's probably here to try his luck and see if he can enter the 1,000-year clan and find an opportunity. Lu Chen replied with a and didn't say anything else. This kind of background was the most common. 9 out of 10 newcomers who came to Qingshideng village in a year had this kind of mindset. Old Ma continued, Li Ji indeed has a good appearance. Not long after he came to this village, he has already gained the favor of many people in the village. In addition, his painting skills are excellent, and he often paints on the west bank. His paintings are all lifelike, and most of them add a bit of charm, so he has gained the favor of the women in the village. Lu Chen thought for a while, then smiled and said, this village has been lifeless for a long time. No wonder those women were tempted when they saw such a flirtatious and handsome man. Old Ma snorted, looking unconcerned, then added, oh yes, this Li Ji is also a newcomer. I mentioned that there are 3 or 4 people who are suspicious of the evil cult, and he is one of them. Lu Chen's brows immediately furrowed, as if he thought of something, and his face instantly darkened. After leaving the tavern, Lu Chen walked along the Qingshui Creek towards his grass hut at the foot of the mountain. Along the way, he saw the clear and slow flow of the Qingshui Creek, the green bamboo and peach blossoms reflected in the water, creating a beautiful scenery. Halfway there, Lu Chen suddenly heard a clamor of laughter coming from the opposite shore. His heart skipped a beat and he turned his head to look. Sure enough, he saw 3 or 4 women standing on the western shore, covering their mouths as they chatted and laughed. In front of them was the handsome and outstanding Li Ji, who was smiling as he put away his brush and wooden board. Suddenly, there were footsteps behind him, sounding somewhat familiar. Lu Chen slightly tilted his head to look, only to see a familiar figure walking past him, walking towards the stone bridge on the creek. Her figure was graceful, and her hair was like the clouds. It was Ding Dang. The woman looked at the other side, lightly lifting her skirt as she walked over, but did not notice Lu Chen, who was standing not far away. Lu Chen looked at her back, then looked at Li Ji, who was chatting cheerfully with the women on the other side, slightly shook his head, then turned and walked into the distance. Not long after, he saw the shadow of the grass hut at the foot of the mountain. There were many residents in Qingshui village today, but there was only one grass hut built at the foot of T Mountain. As for the reason, it was actually very simple. It was because when the mountain wind blew at night, there would often be a sharp, ghostly wailing sound. It was extremely terrifying. Thus, in the past few years, Lu Chen lived alone in peace, other than being a little noisy at night. Walking to the door of the grass hut, Lu Chen first looked around, and after confirming that there was nothing strange, he then pushed the door open and walked in. In the grass hut that could not be considered too big, there was a person lying on the bed. It was the Kunlun party disciple, Hong Chuan, whom he met yesterday. At this moment, Hong Chuan was lying on the bed with his eyes tightly shut, but his chest rose and fell rhythmically. It did not seem like he was seriously injured, it seemed like he was still in a dream. Lu Chen smiled. He had no intention of waking Hong Chuan up. He just randomly pulled a stool over, and sat by the door. Then, he looked outside the door at the scenery of the mountain village in the distance. He did not say a word, his eyes flashing slightly. It seemed like he was thinking about something. His patience was surprisingly good. Even if Hong Chuan did not wake up, Lu Chen still did not show any signs of anxiousness. It seemed like to him, as long as he was willing, it did not matter even if he waited for 3 days and 3 nights. However, of course, things would not be so exaggerated. It was probably not noon. After the sun had risen and shone on Qingshui village, Hong Chuan's body moved slightly, and he woke up from his dream. He seemed to open his eyes with some difficulty, and then looked around with a trace of confusion. Suddenly, his body shook, and he turned over and sat up, then looked around with a shocked expression, and very soon, he saw Lu Chen sitting by the other side of the door of the straw hut. Lu Chen looked at him, and said with a smile, "You're awake?" When Hong Chuan saw Lu Chen, he was also shocked, and then said, "Brother Lu, why is it you?" As he spoke, he looked at the straw hut that he was in, and could not help but ask again, "Where am I?" Lu Chen said, "This is where I live. It is a straw hut at the foot of T Mountain. My house is simple, Brother Hong. I am sorry to let you suffer." Hong Chuan immediately shook his head, and then a strange expression appeared on his face. He said, Why am I here?" Lu Chen did not hide anything. He told everything he saw last night, as well as how he found Hong Chuan in the pool and saved him. You're tuning in to the Carefree Valley YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.